and they didn't want to be. And they saw an opportunity to use technology to change this. And in 2005, as part of their thesis, Senator, if you don't mind, I think we have a copy of the slides for you there, and I'll just keep going. So as part of their graduating thesis in 2005 that they wrote, they wanted to design products for social change because they knew that every cigarette that they had as smokers and every cigarette that anyone else had as smokers were inherently self-destructive. And I think this is important to mention because the original intent of our company is to design for that positive social change to address the destructive nature of cigarettes. And this intent is the foundation of our company's mission, which is to improve the lives of the world's 1 billion smokers by eliminating cigarettes and eliminating all the harm associated to cigarettes. And we've seen some early success in doing this. Last week, you heard about stories from the UK, Japan, and Sweden, and we've seen similar results in the US. Historically, tobacco and cigarette sales in the US have declined at 0 to 2.5% year over year. Since Juul was launched in the US, tobacco is declining at historically unprecedented rates, most recently up to 10% year over year. We're proud of this result, but we have a long way to go. But we're not here to talk about the US, we're here to talk about the Philippines. There are 16 million adult smokers in the Philippines, and I think we all agree that smoking causes these people and society an immense amount of harm. I think everybody in this room wants to play a role in solving this problem. But the problem is extremely difficult to solve. 75% of Filipinos say that they want to quit, but only 4% are successful in doing so. Smoking is one of the hardest things in the world to stop doing, and traditional efforts and options available to smokers have not eliminated this problem. We believe that this problem can be solved with technology by providing an alternative to smoking, and this is where Juul comes in. It was designed by smokers, for smokers, to meet the needs of smokers, and we believe that we're the first true alternative to cigarettes. And by providing this alternative, we believe that we can achieve our mission. I think it's really important to be clear about our intentions. We do not want any non-smoker to use our products, and we do not want youth to use our products. This would be bad for our mission and bad for public health and bad for society. Now that we've introduced ourselves, we want to respond to a number of specific arguments that were made last week. Last week, arguments were made in two general topics. There were a number of product-related arguments that were non-scientific related, things like battery safety, and there were a number of science-related arguments. I'm going to talk about the products, and Dr. Amar is going to talk about the science. So when talking about the products, I think it's important to mention that while there are many valid risks that were brought up in the committee, these risks do not equally apply to all products in the market, and they certainly do not equally apply to Juul products. We believe that these risks should be and can be addressed via regulation, not tax, and it's unclear exactly how these tax proposals will address these risks. In fact, it's possible that the proposed tax would increase the risk due to increased incentives for illicit trade. So the first thing to understand about the Juul product when talking about products in the category is that Juul is different. And in a very quick series of slides that aren't on the screen, I can explain why. So Juul has industry-leading temperature control. Juul has industry-leading battery safety. We are not implicated in any of the reports on explosions. When it comes to ingredients, Juul has extremely high standards. For example, diacetyl is not an ingredient in our products. There are many reports of lung illnesses. These seem to be connected to THC and toxic levels of vitamin E. These are not ingredients in Juul's products. There are reports of unintended exposures, like poisonings, and unintended use, like narcotics. We are a closed system, and we're not designed to be opened or refilled. There are reports of deceptive nicotine labeling. We have clear labeling on our products, and we do not sell non-nicotine products. There are reports about insufficient age verification in e-commerce. We have a very different standard in this market. We require purchasers to have both an uploaded photo ID and a selfie to validate that they are of age. No one else in the Philippines does this. There are reports about flavors and packaging designed to appeal to underage people. Our flavors and packagings are not designed this way. They're meant to be factual and straightforward to minimize any appeal. There are reports of predatory marketing practices. To be clear, we follow all local laws and regulations. We do not have a Facebook or Instagram account. We do not use paid social media influencers. We are proactive in removing unauthorized content. We don't sponsor events or concerts, and we have a strict marketing code of conduct to minimize exposure to underage people.
Can you, I need to digest this for a second, so
Sure.
just give me a second. Why don't you finish? I skipped forward, but you only have like a page or two to go before you go to the scientific evidence. So why don't you finish that, and then I'll ask you my questions.
Sure. So in summary, the risks that were brought up in the last hearing are certainly valid. However, these risks do not apply equally across all products, and they certainly don't apply to us. And more importantly, we believe like these risks can be addressed via regulation and should be and can be addressed via regulation, not with tax. It's unclear how the proposed tax structure would address these, and it may actually enhance these risks
It may enhance.
due to illicit trade.
Okay. Are you going to conclude, or is that it? Is that it?
That's it. If you want to go to the science, we can now.
Before that, well, let me just make a quick comment on your statement. I don't think you're asking me a question, but your statement that you don't know how the tax measure will address this. Well, part of the recommendations could be not to tax and to ban all the products. So that's how it becomes relevant, just for everybody's information. Just because the proposal of DOF is to tax, I can submit a committee report that says I will, of the opinion that it should be banned outright. So that's how it becomes relevant in this hearing. Okay. I'm just curious. So you are the president of Juul Labs Asia Pacific, and so you represent what countries fall under your jurisdiction?
Everything south of Taiwan, so everything in Asia excluding Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China.
Okay. And I'm just curious if a lot of these statements that you made, which I have to say, I have to tell everyone here that I always have high regards for companies that learn from mistakes, learn from experience, who on their own professionalize their operations. And when I say professionalize, are ethically marketing, are ethically operating. I do appreciate that. So when you point out concerns that you feel do not apply to your company. I do appreciate that information because I always tell in the hearings that I chair, I always tell the industries that I am very much appreciative when I see efforts to self-regulate because I think it's unfair to expect all the regulations to come from government. I mean, we're a developing country and we're not in a position to do that. So I do appreciate that. Whether I agree or not is something else, on the effects of your self-regulation, on the outcome, but
Sure.
the effort is noted. So my question is, are the things that you said, are these already reactions to either experiences or regulations that have happened in other jurisdictions where Juul operates, such that you are now here saying that, like for example, you are only selling X flavors, and is that menthol, non-menthol, where is that? Is that the same in other jurisdictions, or is this because you're being more, you're truly trying to just target an adult market as opposed to having bubble gum and unicorn flavors?
It's a great question. So we only intend to target adult smokers. The flavors that we have are meant to be minimally appealing to underage people. And furthermore, in behavioral studies, we see that flavors play an important role in switching a smoker away from a cigarette. We've done studies that show when smokers have access to multiple flavors, they're somewhere between 20 to 50% more likely to switch away
Okay.
from cigarettes. Now, that being said, flavors should be marketed and sold extremely responsibly, and we believe that no company should be selling flavors as you described, bubble gum or other youth-oriented
But
flavors.
have these kind of flavors been sold by Juul in other jurisdictions?
No.
No. So your company has never sold offered this type of flavors
Like a
with
bubble
these
gum?
appealing names?
No.
Okay. And what about the contraption that's used? Do you have like 1,000 versions of the color blue and pink and
I have a product for you here, if somebody could help me walk it over. We have two device colors, slate, which is black, and then silver. And then this is our packaging here, so I'll send you over some.
and the device cover? How many colors does it come in?
Two, slate
Two.
and silver.
Okay. So I have to put on record that that in itself impresses me because I just know that marketing to the youth includes offering all these options and the latest color. In fact, if you had told me that you have whatever, let's say 10 colors, I was going to say, are you willing to ensure that the colors you offer are 10 years ago, so that the young people be like, oh, I don't want that color. It's just not appealing at all. I'll not be caught dead holding that contraption. But since you only have two, I don't know how much you can go with gray.
Correct.
Gray.
We market our products to be simple, factual, and straightforward, to communicate only as much information as we need to the consumer. And in everything we do, we try to minimize appeal to underage people.
Okay. And the statements that you have no social media presence, you don't have any paid social media influencers, is this an outcome of past experiences in other jurisdictions? Did you previously have in other countries?
Yes, in the past, Juul has previously had a social media presence. However, that social media presence was very reserved in the content that we put on there. We have done some things that we are not proud of in the past, but we have taken aggressive and industry-leading actions to mitigate any risks of exposing our products to youth or appealing to youth.
Okay. I'm actually told that you have fruit flavors, including mango.
We have 4 flavors:
Okay, so what is it?
tobacco, mint, creme, and mango.
And you're amenable to recommendations to make it less attractive to the youth. So if we came out with not me per se, but if the health sector, DOH, or even our committees, other committees like health, comes out with such recommendations, you would be amenable?
We will follow all local laws and regulations, no matter what they are. However, I would offer some caution here. Not everybody loves the taste of tobacco. And when a smoker is trying to switch away from
Yeah.
cigarettes, they don't want to be
Right.
reminded
Understand.
of tobacco.
But like, just like in the cigarette industry, the alternative there was mint, right?
Correct.
So to me, if I were to be in a position to recommend, I would say just stick to tobacco and mint, or if you can come up with something that has no flavor. But anyway, that's not the time. It's just my out of curiosity
Sure.
that I'm asking you these questions. So the sales that we see online are from secondary markets, are
So when
parallel
Juul,
importations.
when
What are they?
Juul Labs is present in the Philippines, and we have
And then when was the presence officially? When did it officially begin?
in mid-June.
Of this year?
Yes, correct.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So we sell our products online via an e-commerce website, juul.ph. And in order for anybody to buy on that website, the individual, the purchaser, has to upload a government-issued ID, and they have to take a selfie. And we have AI and human verification to confirm that the ID is of that person, and then only can they purchase the product. This is
Okay.
not required by law. It's not a regulation. It's something we do as a self-regulation.
Thank you. Okay, let me leave it at that. Go ahead with your scientific evidence.
Okay, Dr. Amar.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. If I could just take a couple of minutes to introduce myself and my background and how I happen to be here with Juul. I'm a physician, an internal medicine and infectious disease specialist. I'm a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians of Canada. I started my career in academia. I was associate professor of medicine at the University of Calgary, and I was a consultant in infectious diseases at the teaching hospital in Calgary. And I did that for a decade before moving over into the pharmaceutical industry in research and drug development. And I just want to point out that I was an infectious disease physician practicing at the time of the HIV era, so there was a lot of like what to do with the tough social issue at the time. In the pharmaceutical industry, I was 18 years in R&D developing new drugs. My focus was going from treating patients one by one, maybe 20 or 30 a day, to try to come up with innovative new medicines, which I'm very proud to say I did. There are cancer drugs for liver cancer, the first agents for liver cancer on the market. Thank you, Siri. Okay. So cancer drugs, drugs for blood clots, blood thinners, and antibiotics. So I'm not exaggerating. I was part of a team on designing drugs that have treated hundreds of thousands of patients. I joined Juul 1st of August this year, so I'm very new with Juul, and I'm just figuring it out. But
Is it your first Senate hearing?
It's my first. I was here last week as well.
Okay,
So
but I mean the first time to speak. I'm just curious.
It's the first time to
Okay.
speak, indeed. I've not experienced this before. So I just like to say that
I don't know if somebody tipped you off to get on my good side, but
Oh.
my father had liver cancer, so
Oh, no, I was not aware of
I'm
that.
always interested in that field also, and
Yeah.
of course, I'm thankful for your contributions.
Thank you for sharing that, Madam Chairperson. So, so I joined Juul, and the reason I joined Juul, I thought about it a little bit because this is a departure for me coming from to this, but it didn't take me very long because, one of the most intractable problems is smoking worldwide. There are still 1 billion smokers. I've never smoked. My father is 97 this October. He never smoked. My mother is 88, and she's never smoked. None of my children, my 2 daughters, smoke. But I have had friends, who have suffered from smoking and who have passed away because of smoking, and my father-in-law as well, unfortunately. So smoking is a big problem. And when I see Juul in particular and the ENNDS category, I'm really filled with hope because this is actually something new. which addresses the problem of smokers. It allows them to switch. It dissociates the nicotine, which is what they're addicted to, from all the harmful products which come from burning tobacco and tar. Okay? And this is actually, it seems so simple, but it's really a major shift. So what smoke...
Can you hold on a minute? I
Yeah.
just need to make a notation. Go ahead.
So smokers, they smoke for the nicotine, but it's the tar that kills them, right? And nicotine, as as my colleague Mr. Bishop mentioned, is an incredibly difficult addiction to break. And I have witnessed, patients when I was in clinical practice, who have all kinds of ill consequences, but they continue to smoke because they're unable to give up smoking. So it's not just that they like, but they cannot quit. They know the consequences. They know the cost, taxes, etc. They're unable to. So what a product like Juul is doing, it's providing them relief for their addiction, but reducing the harm as much as possible. And, this is later on in the slide deck. You will see that, there's an increasing body of evidence and a body of opinion from the American Cancer Society, the Royal College of Physicians, National Academy of Sciences. I'm going a little bit out of sequence here, if you don't mind. I'm just going out of sequence a little bit, if you don't mind, rather than reading the slides. So, so there's a growing body of expert opinion, which is coming in favor of e-cigarettes and ENNDS in terms of harm reduction. Okay, so I think clearly the target for this, for ENNDS, for Juul, is smokers and to help smokers quit. It's not for non-smokers. So when we look at any new product like Juul, okay, it's a relative harm reduction. It's a relative safety. I mean, I worked for a company, Bayer or Bayer, as in some parts of the world, and they're famous for making aspirin. But even aspirin is not without ill effects. So every compound, every product needs to be used responsibly. So e-cigarettes and Juul are meant for smokers. They offer harm reduction, but they're not frivolous, harmless, totally safe. No one is claiming that. So in all of our slides, and again, if you like, I can go through them. So the next slide looks at, what is present in the vapor of tobacco smoke versus in Juul. And if we see all the harmful products, and this experiment was done by hooking up to a machine, a Juul device, vaporizing Juul, versus cigarettes into the analyzer. And the red bars show the harmful products of tobacco smoke from the cigarettes, and the blue bars, which are actually not even visible because they're like, 99% less, are from what comes from Juul. Because Juul is not a tobacco product. It's a nicotine extract that is turned into a salt. So there are none of these harmful and potentially harmful products there. So this is in just the chemistry of what people inhale. So the next slide looks at actually what happens to people once the vapor goes into them, whether it's smoke or the Juul vapor. And this is an experiment that we've done, but many have been done like this, where we took 90 adult smokers and we divided them into 3 experimental groups. One group, we had abstained completely from smoking for 5 days. The second group, we had them to stop smoking and switch to Juul products and the different flavors of Juul that Mr. Bishop talked about. And then the third group were regular smokers. They just kept smoking their regular cigarettes. So this is 90 smokers who, one group abstained, the second group switched to Juul, the third group kept smoking. And the next slide shows the results of what we found in their urine and in their blood. So this is the toxins and how the toxins manifest themselves in body fluids. And when we look at all the different classes of toxins, this is the results we see. So going from left to right. The gray bars is the group 1 that didn't smoke at all, okay, that abstained. The multicolored bars are those that smoked the different flavors of Juul, so all Juul, but the black bars, in fact, show the smokers, so the effects of the tar. This is from after 5 days from their urine and their blood. So again, but it makes sense, because with Juul, they're not inhaling these toxins, so they won't have it in their body. So next slide. Okay, so this was a slide that was shown last week by the Dr. Limpen from ASH. Okay, and so in fact, when we look closely at this study, it shows the exact same data. Okay, so next slide. Next slide. So again, there are multiple studies that show decreased toxicants. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So, Madam Chairperson, I just want to just show one very interesting things as to why Juul and ENNDS are so effective compared to, say, nicotine gum and Nicorettes. And I think this is really very instructive. If we look at what happens to the blood, nicotine blood concentrations of smokers when they puff cigarettes, so we see they get a peak of nicotine in their blood. This is kind of like a nicotine rush, which gives them the relief of their addiction. Juul-like compounds, so even at the highest strength, mimic this. So they give them the nicotine, but at a slightly higher dose. Gum and Nicorettes, on the other hand, have a much slower uptake because they're chewed, they're swallowed, and so they do not provide the same relief to smokers. Okay, next slide. Okay. And next slide again.
Just before you leave that slide that showed the curve, so you're saying that it's the puffing, the inhaling that replicates.
Exactly. So actually, we're delivering the nicotine in the same way, the same route, the oral route that smokers get. So it mimics it. So that's why kind of the vaping is necessary, because I mean, pharmaceutical companies have made nicotine patches, they've made nicotine gum, so they're all different delivery systems, but it's giving it the wrong way. So what nicotine addiction and what smokers need is this quick surge, right? And I think if one observes smokers, you can see there's this anxiety to light up, and then they light a cigarette, and then suddenly they start feeling relaxed, and the addiction is a bit quelled. And this is what actually Juul offers. Okay. So next slide. So this next is a behavioral study of what we've observed in a study that we've done with 7,700 smokers, okay, who were given Juul and switched to Juul. And what we found that, in fact, after 3 months, 56% completely switched off cigarettes. 56%, okay? And the number of cigarettes that they stopped smoking, it was basically a decrease from when there were smokers was in this group 929,000 cigarettes to 0 cigarettes. So this is a huge harm reduction for these individuals. Now the 46% who did not completely switch, they were both using Juul and cigarettes, but in them also, and this is in the second, the second set of bars in the middle, in them too we see a decrease in the number of cigarettes they smoked from 1.14 million down to 550,000 cigarettes during this 3-month period. So the total amount of tobacco exposure, the secondhand smoke, the effect on their families, their children, I mean, this is what the potential of ENNDS is, and this is why I'm so excited, about the hope that this category offers.
My question is, this slide doesn't show the first-time Juul users who have never smoked. And I think that's the concern of the health
Yes.
sector, correct?
Yes, correct, Madam Chairperson. And I think that
So
is
in the end, whoever of you will answer this question, the question would be, what are you doing, aside from what was already mentioned by Mr. Bishop, to really address that? And like I said in my previous hearing, I'm not just concerned about those who are 17 years old, 11 months and 29 days. I'm concerned about those who are 18 years old and 1 month, 19 years old, 20. They're still young professionals. And since I'm on that track, and I leave that to you to answer whoever, does your 5-year, 10-year, 30-year plan include a slowdown in your business? Because technically, if you are successful, then there should be very few, or should not be worth continuing your business unless you will have new smokers. So
That is somewhat correct, Senator. So our product strategy is centered around two principal tenets. The first one is harm reduction, which is what we're describing here today. The second is habit control. Harm reduction and habit control. With habit control, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create technology that allows users to manage their nicotine consumption, make their nicotine consumption transparent to them, and then support them on whatever destination they want to go in. If they want to maintain a certain level, they would be able to do that. And if they want to reduce completely, they would be able to do that. And we want to give them tools and solutions to allow them to get off of nicotine if that's what they want, and we would be extremely supportive of that. Now, in support of this initiative, we have launched in the last 6 weeks a connected device. So we now have a Juul device that will connect to your smartphone, and that will give you the ability to track the number of puffs and the amount of consumption that you take by hour, by day, by month. And it also allows you to lock your device to prevent unintended usage. And in the future, as we improve the technology, we can use a lot of solutions to help people to manage towards some sort of consumption goal. So we're in the early stages, harm reduction, but we're investing a significant amount of R&D to create technology to support people on habit control.
please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson.
So yeah, so I do have that outstanding question. I don't know if there's an answer to it as to the
Madam Chair-
slide not portraying the
Yeah.
entire picture, which includes the
So-
number of growing young users. I'll not use the word youth, but just young users.
So we do have behavioral studies that show how many Juul users initiated nicotine on Juul. I don't know the number on the top of my head, but I will make sure that I get that study to your staff. It is not zero. There is some unintended use, and we will be transparent about that. However, our goal is to minimize that use, and most importantly, what we see in the data is that the majority of our users are existing smokers. So I'll share that study with you.
Other countries, are you tracking the use of by age bracket?
Yeah, Avi, if we can go to the slides that show the youth usage data. So in most countries around the world, next slide, Avi. In most countries around the world, regular use of nicotine and e-cigarettes is tracked. And I've got a few case studies here. This is the UK. And you can see in the top left square here, regular e-cigarette use, and it tracks 2014, 2016, 2018. It goes from, 1.6, I can't read it, to 2.2 down to 2. So regular use of e-cigarettes in the UK has not grown in the past 3 years, and it's declined since last year. And I'll get to the US in a minute. If you go to the next slide. In Canada, the latest data shows that use by youth is 1.6 on an occasional basis. And 1.6 regular use, and occasional use is 5%. And you can see a statement here from Health Canada saying that they see youth usage as relatively low. In the next slide. In New Zealand, this is a study that actually came out yesterday. A multi-year study by ASH New Zealand and the National Institute of Health declared that usage of e-cigarettes from 14 to 15-year-olds is extremely low. And if you go to the next slide, in the United States, this is data from NYTS, the National Youth Tobacco Survey. This is the gold standard for surveys. This is what the FDA uses. And you can see that there's a number of underage people who report a past 30-day use, and there's a 5.8% rate of regular use, which is higher than the other countries. However, the text below that 5.8% is extremely important, 8 out of 9, 88% of these people who regularly use were smokers before they used. Now, just to be clear, our goal is to have no underage usage at all, and we are taking aggressive industry-leading actions to prevent that. And any underage person who uses our product is simply unacceptable, but it's important to look at the actual facts that come from independent third parties to have a fact-based discussion about the youth use of these products.
Okay. Just to put on record, in the presentation of DOF, I know that like most of you, you skip a few slides. I don't know if it was in the actual shown here, but it's in the file that I have. For the US, it shows 78% increase among high school students. These are e-cig users, and 48% among middle school users. So can we just, figure out our figures later on? I just want to put that. You can quickly respond, but I'm just saying.
Yeah.
And I've read a lot of other figures similar to that, so that's
So
my concern.
the study that the US FDA uses is the NYTS, the National Youth Tobacco Survey. This is where the data comes from. There's different types of usage. There's ever tried, there's frequently used, there's occasionally used, and there's regular use. But we will happily furnish the full report to you.
Thank you. So, time check. My staff tells me that you've run out of time, but go ahead because I used up some of your time. So let's go ahead, and then you have one more speaker. So
Okay. Thank you very
Proceed.
much, Madam Chairperson. So I'll move ahead very quickly. Next slide. Yeah. So I just want to show some data. Again, this shows smoking prevalence data in some key countries. So when we look at Canada, the US, and UK, these are countries that obviously have all the tobacco control measures in place, but they also allow e-cigarettes and ENNDS. And when we see what is happening is, we see actually when we map out the e-cigarette usage versus the declining prevalence in smoking, there is a correlation in that it seems like there's a deceleration or actually a faster decrease in smoking prevalence in Canada, the US, and the UK. Now, I would like to say that this is just a correlation. It does not imply causation. In a slides like this, there are many, many factors. But nonetheless, it is quite interesting to see that there is no upward blip, that you suddenly find e-cigarettes and now there's a flattening or an increase in the smoking prevalence. So two points here. One is that the e-cigarettes seem to increase the rate of decline, and two, there is no evidence of an increased rate because of youth vaping turning into new smokers. My next.
and just for the record, as we pointed out in the last hearing, there obviously would be other interventions
Yes,
on the
yes,
part
yes,
of government mostly that should be taken into consideration, which you also pointed
Yes.
out
Indeed.
is,
Very-
not alluding to it specifically, but that it's not the sole cause.
Exactly, and very well observed.
But I have to say that because when people will look at the transcripts of our record, they will just pull that out, and I don't want to have any.
Yes.
I want to minimize the misleading statements. That come out.
Absolutely, Madam
Okay.
Chairperson.
Go
And
ahead.
and we need to really use science to discover the truth. We cannot use selective science to advance an agenda. I mean, we're talking about health and health consequences. And I think in terms of, now I'm with Jewel, when I leave, what would I have left behind? What kind of legacy, not only for Jewel, but for smokers? And I think it would be, that's the way I prefer to think. The next slide actually shows the same type of data, but for countries that actually have very strict tobacco control but do not allow ENDS. So Singapore has one of the strictest tobacco control measures. In fact, it's one of the few countries that you cannot take duty-free cigarettes, buy duty-free cigarettes and allowed. You're not allowed one stick into Singapore. You can't smoke on their whole streets where you can't smoke in Singapore. So they're very strict. But when you look at the data in terms of prevalence, the decline has plateaued. So, from the national health figures, in 2004, the smoking prevalence was around 12%, 12.6%. And in 2017, it's about 12%. So for a country like Singapore, there are limits to how much by raising taxes, putting plain labels, warnings, not allowing smoking. There are limits to that, as opposed to the other countries where we saw with e-cigarette use, there was a decline because people actually do prefer an alternative, it would appear. So, next slide.
Let me just acknowledge the presence of our Minority Floor Leader, Senator Frank Dillon.
Okay. So next slide. So, as part of the growing body of evidence, which shows, the content of the vapor versus smoke, the biomarkers, what smokers are exposed to in their body, in their blood, and also the switching behavior that's occurring that, in fact, surprisingly now, the smokers who, all the measures have slowed down the decline are now, stopping smoking and switching in really very encouraging numbers. And based on this, several notable and internationally recognized authorities have come up and made statements about e-cigarettes, ENNDS, and vapors in saying that this is an important strategy in harm reduction. And the College of Physicians in England has even said that e-cigarettes have the potential to prevent almost all of the harm from smoking in society. I mean, this is all as part of the slide deck, and I don't have to read it. But again and again, this is what they're saying, and based on this, health bodies, public health bodies, are also shifting their position, and thinking that, in fact, e-cigarettes and ENNDS are a tool in the armamentarium in terms of controlling, tobacco smoke and smoking and improving health outcomes. So Madam Chairman, that is my presentation. I sincerely thank you for your indulgence and the time, and for your attention, and for being here today.
Quick response. If you can bring the slide back to the quotations from the various medical associations, agencies, etc. I think now's the best time for me to put on record this concern I have. This is the FDA news release issued yesterday or 2 days ago, September 9, 2019. And you can find this on their website. So let me just quote a portion that concerns me. So this is basically a statement by FDA asking Juul to explain certain statements and actions, or it's a warning letter, according to my staff, to put it more clearly, to explain certain statements that they have made. And so I quote here the FDA warning letter. It says here that Juul's labeling, advertising, and or other activities directed to consumers represent or would be reasonably expected to result in consumers believing that the products, one, present a lower risk of tobacco-related disease, or are less harmful than one or more commercially marketed tobacco products, two, contain a reduced level of a substance or present a reduced exposure to a substance, and or three, do not contain or are free of a substance or substances. So I have to say, from a non-medical perspective, my background is law, and my colleague here, Senator Frank Dillon, is also a lawyer. That is the impression I get. So I am one of those consumers who, the result of whom led me to believe those things. It has led me to believe those things. And even you, Mr. Ken Bishop, made a statement that people smoke for nicotine, but it's the tar that kills them. So if I take that statement alone, I'd be like, oh, okay. So if it's the tar that kills them, then therefore this product is better for, not for me, I don't smoke, but if I were to recommend. And then you also made a statement that Juul's objective is to reduce the harm. So there are those kind of statements that
Sure.
I repeatedly hear coming from the whole industry, including Juul.
I understand your concern. We are aware of the FDA letter. We intend to fully collaborate and cooperate with their requests. I think it's important to note that what we are sharing with you here today is in no way intended for consumers. These are things that we're talking about purely for a legislative and rulemaking discussion, and we will abide by whatever laws and regulations require us to abide by. And if the FDA in the Philippines or any other country has requirements on how and when and who should make health claims, we would absolutely follow those requirements. Now, I think one thing that's important is to separate the underlying science and the FDA's belief about the science, and then how they enforce and manage their regulatory process. And I think it's important to sort of think of those things separately in terms of how you're thinking about the rulemaking here. The science should be objective and clear. What companies can and can't do and when and how they do it should be subject to regulations.
Appreciate that distinction. We have media present here though, so the minute they report on it, it becomes for consumers. It becomes for the consumption of the consumer. So that's why I would also request that when you make your statements, you also clarify that, because if you can exercise your rights as a company and comply with the highest level of requirements in some country, then I'll also ask you to try to do the same in our country for the benefit of the general population, particularly the youth.
Absolutely. We are
Okay.
more than willing to do that.
And I do appreciate that clarification, but I think that could have been done early on, that there are some statements that are for the consumption of the body, for whatever legal discussion, but is not for the consumer's consumption, because precisely as a consumer, there is no way that I am not led to believe that this product is safer, less harmful, and throw it all in there.
Senator, I would respectfully like to point out on the second slide of the deck, we do have that statement. Unfortunately, we had the technical difficulty,
okay.
but I 100% agree with you,
Okay.
and it was there. We thought of that.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, Dr. Amar.
Madam Chairperson. Having worked in drug development and had many interactions with the FDA, I think it's important to understand where the FDA is coming from. When they say you can't make a claim, what they're saying is, you have not provided the clinical data yet to make that claim, right? So, for example, if we say a drug lowers blood pressure, well, you have to do the studies to show that.
I wouldn't want you to make that claim without
Exactly.
proving that you have done those studies,
Exactly.
even though you may
Yeah.
have all the materials to convince me visually that it looks like it's the right thing.
No, exactly. But so, what we are doing here is, we are showing the factual stuff, which, we can demonstrate in the sense of what is present in the vapors, right? What happens in the urine and blood of people, okay? But at no point have we said that Juul will reduce harm. What we're saying is that the ENNDS category, because of the way it works, has this, potential of offering smokers a solution. And this is something which is recognized by various health bodies, which we are quoting. So I think the difference here is, we are not making a marketing claim around our product. We are looking at the science, okay, of this whole category and all the studies that have been done, and what are the voices that are now the direction of this that is being pulled. So this is, I think, sometimes it's not easy to understand. Is this a marketing claim for consumers? You're saying your product will do this, versus a scientific discussion in sort of a regulatory government platform that is talking about, what is the impact of this. So we would not go out and say.
I mean, I can make that distinction because that will be that will be the reason why we would say that this product should be legally allowed to be sold and not allowed to be sold, but you may not be able to market that way. So I appreciate it. I'm just saying that at the end of the day, all of these statements will be repeated on media, and then you have the consumers who are concerned. But let's leave it at that. We need to move on. I do appreciate the explanation. You're done.
Thanks. I'm done. Thank you.
We have another speaker, and that would be Dr. Tiki Pang.
Senator, just one last thing. We have data on global tax policies on ENNDS. If we have a couple more minutes, I would love to share that data as well.
Okay. After Dr. Tiki
Sure.
Pang. Okay. Or maybe I will give you the floor later, so you're talking about tax consequences specifically, right? So maybe after Dr. Tikipang, I'll give the floor to the health advocates, and then we can talk about the taxation after.
Sure.
Thank you. Dr. Pang.
Thank you very much, Senator, for giving me this opportunity. Just by way of background, I have been a scientist and researcher for 22 years. In 1999, I joined the World Health Organization in Geneva, in Switzerland, as director of its research policy department, where my main job was to work with countries to help them better use evidence in making health policy. I worked there for 13 years and I retired in 2012 and returned to academia as a professor in the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. So let me emphasize that I'm here as an independent resource person, and what I want to do is to share my own sort of personal views in the context of harm reduction. Based on my interest in evidence, in the last 2 years or so, I have become, I would say, a supporter of harm reduction. Why? Why do I believe in harm reduction? Amar and Ken has given you all the data. It is basically 3 reasons. E-cigarettes are 95% less harmful than combustible cigarettes. The second reason is that it helps people to quit smoking. The data from the UK, for example, 20,000 quits per year, maybe even more. The third reason that I support the whole concept is that the fear about young people taking up vaping and then becoming cigarette smokers, there's no evidence of that. So this is my own personal view based on my own analysis of the huge amount of evidence that's out there. And it's not just my view. This view is shared by hundreds of independent researchers in the international harm reduction community and by many credible independent organizations, mostly in the West. So that's the background. I'd just like to make actually 3 points, and this goes back to my exposure to global health as a director in the WHO. The first point I want to make is that if you go to the WHO building in Geneva, when you walk in the front door, the mission of the organization is very clear. The attainment of the highest possible level of health for all people. When I saw the growing evidence that here is a product that can help smokers quit, I believe it is unjust, it is unethical, and it's actually a human rights abuse to deny 16 million Filipino smokers, who are mostly in the lower income category, access to these products. So to me, that's my passion, equality for all people affected by this very serious health problem. I come from Indonesia, okay? So I have a personal interest in this. You have 16 million smokers. We have 100 million smokers. So that's my first point. I think the sort of the human rights argument. The second point that I like to make is that while the World Health Organization is looked upon by countries to guide them in their policy, okay, in this particular instance, and I do not want to sound disloyal to my former employers, and I still passionately believe in the importance of WHO. In the case of harm reduction, WHO has taken a fairly negative stance in terms of not supporting the concept. And countries have looked at WHO and said, we are going to take our cue from them. Okay? Now, that's fine. Countries are entitled to do that. My plea is that you should be looking at your own conditions first, not just blindly following what WHO says. You have your own sort of context, your characteristics. What is the size of your disease burden? What is the cost to your healthcare system? What is your regulatory capacity? The Philippines has a tremendous amount of scientific expertise to be able to make your own policy choices, which is relevant to your own particular challenges. So this is just a plea that, yes, WHO can provide guidance. At the end of the day, you know, knowledge may be global, but the use of knowledge is always local. So consider that as sort of the second point. The final point I'd like to make is that, as we have seen, this current debate is acrimonious, is often sort of very divided in terms of opinions, even in terms of scientific evidence, and it sometimes is even becoming very adversarial and emotional. And my own view in terms of moving forward, it's not just about us as scientists telling the policymakers and the regulators, this is the evidence, do something about it. No, it's not about that. I think the dialogue has to be much broader, much more inclusive, so that all the people that are affected by whatever policy you decide will be consulted. I'm referring particularly to the smokers themselves. These are the people that are going to be most affected in terms of access to these products. So the smokers should be part of the dialogue. Civil society, religious and community leaders, so important. In Indonesia, for example, 3 months ago, the leader of Nahdlatul Ulama, which is the largest Muslim organization in Indonesia, they came out with a public document 30 pages long saying harm reduction should be supported because it improves the people's health. So religious community leaders, they should be part of the dialogue. The industry, okay, I believe, in my own view, that in this particular case, the industry is part of the solution. We shouldn't demonize anything with the word tobacco. If you look at the pharmaceutical industry, for example, who has the resources, the know-how, the capability to develop new technologies? They are the only ones. It's the same here. You know, it's sort of to look at them more as technology companies providing new innovations rather than linking them with big bad tobacco. So, you know, widen the consultation. The media, absolutely critical in terms of disseminating and raising awareness with balanced reporting, knowledgeable reporting. So I refer to this as misinformation harm reduction. And we know very well the problem with misinformation and hoaxes, etc. So those are just my 3 points, the human rights argument, the need to make your own policies based on your own priorities, and thirdly, the need for a much broader dialogue. I would just like to end with an observation, because all the years I worked with the WHO, I, as a scientist, used to have hubris. Okay, those of you don't know the term. Hubris means false confidence. I used to think, you know, I'm a scientist, I'm a researcher. Okay, here's the evidence done with the best research. Here, give it to the policymakers. They should be making the right decisions. It doesn't work like that. That's what I realized in my 13 years at WHO. Policymakers, regulators, they have so many other things to consider. And that's why the need for the larger sort of dialogue and consultation. And I think the reality of the situation is very nicely summarized. And I want to quote John Maynard Keynes, who you probably know is a leading economist. And this is what Keynes said about science and policy. He said the following: science does not engage in blank minds that get made up as a result. Science engages with busy minds who have strong ideas about how things are and how things should be. So that's the reality of policymaking. And I fully sympathize with policymakers who have to juggle so many balls in the air, but the starting point should always be objective and unbiased science. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. May I know who is speaking? I have a list, but I want to be sure you're all here. Dr. Yule? Yes? Dr. Suarez? Speaking? Yes? Speaking? Ah, no, not speaking. Okay. Dr. Morales? Speaking? No? Dr. Panganiban? Speaking? Okay. Dr. Abansenia? Speaking? Dr. Nisperos? Ah, attorney. Oh, sorry, attorney. Speaking? Mr. Akupan? Speaking. Dr. Lichon, of course, speaking. Dr. Dan's presenting with a lot of tables and charts. Kailangan fresh na fresh. Hindi kita pwede ihuli dahil baka hindi na ma-absorb ng brain cells ng iba yung magagandang charts mo. Mr. Oh, sabi nga ni Senator Drilon, marami-rami kayo. Mr. RJ Mercado. Okay. So, I'll bunch you together ha. Yung hindi medical is Mr. RJ, si Mr. Attorney Nesperos, and Aljon. No? Okay. All the others are medical. Okay. Very, very quick reaction before we go to the health sector. Thank you, Professor Pang, for your statements. I think you will realize that precisely why all of you are here and the senators have not gone home is precisely because we're trying to have a very detailed discussion on this and not limiting ourselves to one or two experts or so-called experts. So that is really what we're trying to do. But I do beg to disagree with that there's no evidence of young people picking up e-vaping. Just from my own non-scientific survey among the youth that I know, and these are the friends of my children, a lot of them have just taken up vaping and they were not smoking before. And for the record, my daughters are both football players. They tell me that they're about the only ones who are not vaping. Maybe because of their commitment to their sport, but all their friends have suddenly taken up vaping. So as I said in my hearing before this, I was a young lawyer at the time that smoking was allowed indoors, and I had to persevere and suffer through my pregnancies with people smoking in my pregnant phase. And I do not want my young children to grow up in an environment where vaping without knowing the full consequences is going to be allowed in the way that cigarette was allowed. So that is my concern for the youth.
Yeah, just a quick response. I don't at all doubt what the statement that you made. My point was that vaping is not necessarily a gateway to smoking combustible cigarettes. That was my point.
Okay, well taken. Had one more comment. My other comment, and this might be addressed to Mr. Bishop instead, but you decide who wants to answer this. There was a statement that Professor Pang made about not depriving the poorest of the poor of and I don't want to quote you because I don't have the transcripts of exactly what you said, but of a device that could possibly help them stop smoking, something to that effect. But my question is, this device is close to 2,000 pesos, and the pods is 300 plus pesos. So if you're a chain smoker and you take this up daily, there goes your income for the day or for over 2 days. And I'm not aware, so kindly educate me. Are you planning to register this as a medical device and ask DOH to make this available to the poorest of the poor through PhilHealth? Because I mean, I need to think forward, and I hope I'm making the professor happy by saying that my brain is not limited to black and white, as you said. So I have to think this way, and so I want to know what the direction is.
So, 2 comments. If you want us to work with PhilHealth on something like that, we would more.
No, I don't. I'm just
Yeah.
asking, what is your global direction, your Asia Pacific direction? I'm just
Sure.
curious. Don't.
So,
I'm not trying to influence you in any way.
So, To improve the lives of the world's 1 billion smokers, you first have to be available to them. Available means physically available so they can purchase, but available also means at a price point that they can afford. So at our current pricing and cost structure, we know that there's a very large number of smokers around the world who cannot afford our products. We are investing a significant amount of R&D capability and research and technology development to develop products that can serve a much lower socioeconomic consumer. It's a big priority for the company, but we don't have a lot of detailed information to share.
I'm a little attracted by the statement of Professor Pang that it is a violation of the human rights of 16 million Filipinos to deprive them access to this product which can have them quit smoking. Is that a correct recollection? Now, how much does this cost locally, if I may ask? This is, 1,600. 1,600 pesos. Isn't the price alone would rebut, would really, if you're saying that, to deprive people of access to this product is a violation of the human rights, my position is at 1,600 pesos, you are already depriving them of human rights because they cannot have access to this kind of a device at 1,600 unless you probably lower it to 10 pesos, you know. I mean, can you react to that, Professor?
Senator, one clarification from my side. I think Dr. Pang was speaking in general terms on the category, not specifically about our products.
In general terms, but I am applying it according to Professor Tang. You know, we should not take the opinion of the WHO on its face, but we should look at our local conditions. And the local condition is that this is 1,000. This is the first time I see this product. I don't really know. I'm just picking up from where Professor Pang has put forward an argument. And to me, if you're saying that to tax this as cigarettes would be a violation of human rights, because in effect, you're saying you're denying people access to a product which can make them quit smoking. My response to you is at 1,600 per this year, you're already violating the human rights of 16 million Filipinos by not allowing them access to a product which will help them quit smoking. Can you respond to that, Professor?
I think, as Ken said, I was speaking generally about harm reduction, and I wasn't referring at all to that specific
Now I'm telling
product.
I'm telling you that the market price of this is 1,600. Would you now agree with me that the price alone deprives or violates the human rights of 16 million Filipinos because they cannot afford to buy this? Applying it on the local conditions, because as you had so clearly emphasized, we should not follow blindly WHO prescriptions, but we should apply it to our local condition. Our local condition is that this is 1,600 pesos, and therefore you violate, under your theory, the human rights of 16 million Filipinos by not allowing them access. My statement is, by pricing it at 1,600, 16 million Filipinos, the human rights of 16 million Filipinos are violated. Would you agree with that? That's our local condition, by the way.
Yes, I did not really want to go into sort of the pricing issues, but the issue of affordability and access is absolutely what you are saying. So in the context of policy, if you want to turn that argument around, you could say that if that's the local condition, if you want to make sure that it is not a human rights violation, the policies should make it affordable, more affordable. I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert in this area.
Except
Subsidies,
that, yeah,
whatever.
except that the state does not fix the price. It is the company that fixes the price, and we have a free market economy. We cannot, this is not subject to price control. You know, if you want, we can subject it to price control so that it does not violate the human rights of 16 million Filipinos. I will vote for this bill if we have a price control because I have a lot of friends using this. Yes? Hmm.
Senator, I think from an industry point of view, we would be very open to rethinking our pricing policy. And more importantly, we are very open to investing in technology to create products that can serve consumers at lower socio-demographic groups.
So that to be consistent with your theory that they should not violate human rights, you are willing to rethink your pricing policy. Is that what we're getting?
Sorry, and just to be clear, that wasn't a Juul Labs theory, that was Professor Peng's independent theory. But look, we see an affordability challenge all around the world. Smokers who want to make a switch to an alternative need to have access to things that are affordable. So as a company, we are committed to doing this, and we will absolutely think about pricing and technology as mechanisms to do that.
I think, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I think I have,
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
I'm debating as to whether I will make a further comment. I think I will just give the floor to the health. Who said Madam Chair? You are Mr. Iba Bernardo?
Yes, Ibrahim Rasul Bernardo, ma'am.
Quick comment.
A quick comment. Juul is one of many. I'm a consumer. I have been helping people quit smoking using all sorts of devices. And Juul isn't the only device that's available. There are devices that are 500 pesos. There are devices that are, a lot more affordable. Juul just has a lot more R&D and like all of this like safety stuff involved in them. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's move along since we have a long list. Dr. Yul, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Can you introduce yourself again so that our colleagues and the other people know your background very quickly?
My name is Yul
And-
Doroteo. Yes.
I also ask, since there are quite a few of you, if your colleague has already emphasized that point, maybe you can then focus on other points so that we don't have to repeat ourselves and take up everybody's time. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Do we have a clicker? My name is Yul Doroteo, Ulysses Doroteo. I'm a physician. I'm currently the Executive Director of the Southeast Asia Tobacco Control Alliance, or SIATCA. We operate in the 10 ASEAN countries to support tobacco control measures in line with the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. I'm also the co-chair of the Philippine Medical Association's Committee on Advocacy. Okay. Could we go to the next slide, please? Okay. So I think, Madam Chair, you were referring to this particular news as well earlier, where the FDA says Juul had been illegally claiming that its products were safer than cigarettes. And I refer to this because the whole premise of having lower tax rates on ENDS and HTPs is that they are supposedly safer. Could you get the next slide, please? And if we recall...
Sorry,
Yes.
sorry, Dr. Yul, just for the record, are you taking the position that your tax rate should be lower? Or are you not taking any position and just, you don't have to, I'm just curious.
We're going to share global tax policies
Okay,
around the world.
later. Okay, we'll let you do
but
that later.
We believe we should have a relative tax difference to cigarettes,
Okay.
not necessarily low tax. We're happy to pay tax.
Okay.
So this particular slide takes us back to the previous hearing where Philip Morris corrected me and said that the US FDA had not rejected its claims that it had a safer product. And I did not actually say that. I said that the FDA committee, which is the Tobacco Products Scientific Advisory Committee, had rejected its claims that it had a safer product or a less harmful product, what in the US is called a modified risk tobacco product, or MRTP. And it wasn't my word specifically. This is e-cig intelligence, which is an e-cigarette sector website, the New York Times, and another website, CSP Daily. They all say the US FDA committee rejected the IQOS modified risk claim. Next slide.
That is the status. That as of now, it has not given IQOS a modified risk.
Not yet.
Okay.
Madam Chairwoman, the process for the IQOS process in the United States for the MRTP is currently ongoing.
Yes.
The FDA has not rejected. What
Yeah.
they did do is they did authorize us to sell the product in the United States
Right.
under the PMTA process. There's been no rejection. The process is ongoing.
Okay, you're authorized to sell, but you're not authorized to make claims. I think we established this in the last hearing.
We
Not
are
authorized to make claims that it is safer or that it is a modified risk product.
That is
right?
correct,
Okay.
because the process to determine whether or not we can
It
make
is not yet
modified claims
concluded.
is still in
Yes,
progress.
understand. Thank you.
Yes. So what I was saying
Sorry,
was,
question for the industry. Has there been any other brand that has actually been granted that modified
risk.
risk status? Has there been such granted by the US FDA? Just out of curiosity,
Yeah.
if you know.
To our knowledge, none have yet been granted, but companies have just started to apply for this.
Okay.
It is a very, very extensive process. It involves significant submissions of evidence, stakeholder consultation.
Okay.
So a number of companies are going through that
Understand.
process, and we're one of them.
And Juul is also one of them.
We are in the process of preparing and submitting our PMTA.
Okay.
The MRTP would follow after that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So clearly, while the FDA itself has not granted the MRTP status, the FDA's Scientific Advisory Committee is the one that has rejected those claims. This particular slide shows you the FDA's news release on when it allowed IQOS to be sold in the US. And specifically, it also mentions that it does not mean that these products are safe or FDA approved. So I just wanted to make that clear. And the next slide is a reference also to our last hearing where snus was referred to, because it is referred to as a reduced risk product as well. But there is really no evidence to show that it is responsible for Sweden becoming smoke-free. There actually are studies saying that the credit does not go to snus, but to the actual other tobacco control measures in the country. And just earlier this year, Sweden expanded its smoking ban in public places so that it could really be a smoke-free country by 2025, not in relation to snus. And I mention this because in the next slide, snus actually had applied for MRTP status in the US in 2014, and its application was also rejected in 2015. So it does not have reduced risk status as well in the US. Next slide. So the question is, what is really less harmful? Well, everything is less harmful if you compare it to cigarettes. That's a given. Next slide. So if we're talking about safer, or 95% safer, which is the often quoted figure, that is based on what is called tobacco harm reduction, which we've heard many times this afternoon, as being no smoke, no tar, no ash, and therefore it is safer. It reduces the risk to smokers as well as non-smokers because there's no apparent second-hand exposure. And it also helps smokers to quit smoking, which we've heard many times today. But not quitting nicotine, but shifting to these new alternative products. This slide shows you the quote earlier, people smoke for the nicotine but die from the tar, Michael Russell, 1976. And this was a theory back then, okay? It was not proven science. Michael Russell is a British psychologist, He proposed also, theoretically, low tar, high nicotine cigarettes, like what IQOS is supposedly, as well as other ENNDS products. But he has a history of collaborating with British American Tobacco to develop two um, safer cigarette studies. He also engaged with R.J. Reynolds on a study of its heated tobacco product, which is Premier, which also flopped in the US. And he also espoused cigarette filters as a help to reduce risk. But we all know that cigarette filters do not actually do that. Next slide. So the question is the industry really caring about the health of smokers, or are they caring about the profits of their company? Cigarettes are a known drug delivery device. They deliver nicotine, but they have serious health problems, as mentioned by our previous resource persons. But they say that nicotine addiction is not really the problem, right? It doesn't cause health problems. So the challenge for the industry was really, how do we develop products that are quote unquote cleaner? How are they? In the past, the focus of the tobacco industry was to reduce the smoke and the smell. And I would beg the chair's indulgence because there are three speakers from the same company, and if I could just get a little more time. So now they've shifted the debate to, rather than having cleaner and nicer smelling products, to quote unquote safer products. This was a picture shown in the last hearing, and I titled the slide Coffee versus Vodka because we cannot really compare just by looking at this filter pad and say that one is cleaner and therefore it is safer. Total gaseous and particulate matter, or TGPM, is what is measured when we look at tar. Filtration pads only filter out the particulate matter and not the gas. And so if we look at the definition of tar, which is TPGM, minus the water, minus the nicotine, that gives you what is visible. But there is tar present still. If you look at very closely, there is that 10% shade. And that is only what is visible. Okay, next slide. This is a snap from my video from YouTube of an IQOS reviewer who showed us what the IQOS stick looked like after it had been used. And you can visibly see that there is charring. So there is burning. It's not just being heated. Okay? The reviewer himself, excuse me, actually used that word. There is some charring. Next slide. And when we look at e-cigarettes, these are the modifiable electronic nicotine delivery systems. The pictures on the left of the screen are clean and unused. The pictures on the right show you what the coils, these are the heating elements, the metal coils, and the yellow and dark bits are the cotton that are have been soaked and actually are starting to burn. So there is also some burning with e-cigarettes. Next slide. So if we measure based on the chemistry, and this is a journal published just recently, if we subtract water and nicotine from the TGPM, we can actually show that there is tar from IQOS and Glow and Plume Tech, the heated tobacco products. And similarly, there are studies that show that chemicals that are heated, even though they are not burned, produce other chemicals. So while we refer to the activity as vaping, it is not actually just the vaporization of the main ingredients, which are propylene glycol, vegetable glycerine, nicotine, and flavors, but rather these are chemicals that are heated and have chemical reactions and therefore create new chemicals. And that is the aerosol that is inhaled by vapors, as well as secondhand vapors. Next slide. Could we get the next slide? So this was evidence from previously when people thought, oh, if I smoke just one stick a day or once in a while, it's safer than smoking a pack a day. Well, the science doesn't show that. The science shows that smoking just one cigarette a day is also quite harmful. And so are we asking our people to go away from cigarettes, which are 100% poison, to take only 5% poison, right? Is there such a thing as a mild poison? It's still poison. Next slide. The 95% less harmful claim, as I referred to previously was the product of expert opinion of 12 people published in 2014. And if we look at this triangle on the screen, it shows you the level of evidence, the hierarchy of evidence. The weakest evidence is expert opinion. There are case reports, case control studies, cohort studies, randomized control trials, and systematic reviews, meta-analysis. All of those are much stronger, and none of those actually show the 95% less harmful. Next slide. So if we look at the current evidence, there are basically two schools of thought. One is the Public Health England report that reviewed the evidence in 2018, and in the same year, in 2018, the US National Academies of Science also reviewed the same evidence, but came to different conclusions. Next slide. So these are the two reports. Next slide. Both done in 2018. Public Health England says 95% less harmful. The US National Academies of Science says absolute risk cannot be unambiguously determined. Long-term health effects are not yet clear. So next slide. On smoking cessation, Public Health England says it appears to be helpful in the short term. The US report says there is insufficient evidence about the effectiveness for cessation. Next slide. And on youth smoking, Public Health England says e-cigarettes are attracting very few young people, but the US says there is substantial evidence that e-cigarette use increases risk of smoking among the youth. Next slide. So if we look at the overall endorsement of the Public Health England report, they're pretty much the UK groups, which I've listed here. Next slide. As opposed to this slide, which shows you the many other countries and organizations, far outnumbering the UK, that show that we should take a precautionary approach because these products are not safe. And they have actually been banned in more than 40 countries, including 5 countries in our ASEAN region. Next slide. So how bad can it be? And I will rush through this, Madam Chair. Next slide. This is a news story about a vapor who began vaping 2 years previously. He wanted to quit smoking. He ended up buying from his regular vape shop, a well-known brand. It even had a seal, is what the story says. But then he became sick, and he almost died. This is the next slide. So this is him in the ICU, and after recovering from the ICU on his way home. Okay, next slide. This is another young person. She also started vaping, 25 years old, and then developed a severe lung illness, never smoked a cigarette before, so vaping is her first exposure, and she ended up in the ICU as well. Next slide. A teenager, 18 years old, tried several types of e-cigarettes every day for 3 years, and she thought it was fine, and she was nice and cool, and then she ended up in the ICU as well. Next slide. And almost died. So last week, I was going to show you this slide where the US health officials had been investigating 215 cases of severe lung disease, and there was already 1 death. Next slide. Okay, at that time. And then there was a second death. Next slide. Next slide. And now the latest is 2 days ago, it was a few days ago, it was 5, and yesterday it was 6 people now have died in the US from vaping. Okay, next slide. So the question is, vaping has been around in the US for about 10 years now. So why only now? And really, what we are asking is the wrong question. We are actually probably under-reporting these illnesses. They were not recognized before because vaping was quite new. Next slide. So this is a 2014 report, okay, from San Diego, California, where an active duty US sailor developed what's called eosinophilic pneumonitis, and at that time, electronic cigarettes were thought as a possible cause. And I'm showing you the x-rays because on the left you see the cloudiness of the lung fields, on the right, after they had resolved, are much darker. So this is a 20-year-old sailor. Next slide. 2016 in Japan, this is a heated tobacco product. And they also saw eosinophilic pneumonia, and the figures, the x-rays look pretty much the same. A 20-year-old, he was smoking 20 heated tobacco products every day, so like a pack a day, for 6 months. And then he became hospitalized after he had increased his dose to 40 cigarettes a day, 2 packs a day. 2016 in Japan. Next slide. This is in Guam last year, before the whole outbreak in the US. Diffuse alveolar hemorrhage induced by vaping. And the figures, this is an MRI scan of the lungs, and they show you also the diffuse infiltrates on the left, and they had cleared up on the right after treatment with steroids. So 33-year-old male who was not doing any drugs at all, but only vaping nicotine. Next slide. And of course, you saw this from the DOH, explosions and deaths from rockets going into the brain. Next slide. So the evidence really shows us that there are clear harms, not just from the nicotine addiction, but there's also evidence of stroke. So in the US, there's a 22-year-old that has sued Juul for developing a stroke. He was vaping Juul 2 pods a day. So obviously he would develop a stroke. But there's also severe respiratory disease. The US FDA is also exploring the possibility of vaping causing seizures. And then we've also documented mouth dental disease, toxicity, poisoning, including mental health patients who use this to commit suicide, as well as, and then there are also fractures and burns and other trauma. Next slide. So when we go back to 95% less harmful, last week the WHO representative told us jumping off a building from the 5th floor, or actually said 6th floor, is not different from jumping off from the 100th floor. But I would even go further to say that if smoking was like 100 kilometers higher, 5 kilometers is still quite a distance. So 5% does not really mean anything unless you know what the denominator is. And at this point in time, we don't know if it is really 5%. It may be 25%, maybe 50%, or there may be no difference at all in the long-term studies. Next slide. So the real question is, how much more harm is there than not smoking? And even the tobacco companies and the vapors will say that it is not safe. Okay, so definitely the answer is 0. Next slide. So no long-term studies, and less exposure does not mean there is less risk. Next slide. So just let me close with this. If e-cigarettes are really driving cessation in the UK and Japan, and I'm using these as examples because these are the best known examples. Next slide. Last week, I was corrected by the Philip Morris chemist, resource person, who said that, no, we're not saying that heated tobacco products are causing the smoking prevalence to go down. We're just saying that consumption has gone down. But this is a quote from the website of the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, which is established and funded by Philip Morris International. And they are supporting smoke-free products to shift away also from cigarettes. And they say the decline in the Japanese smoking rate has accelerated in recent years as heated tobacco products enter the market, which was similar to one of the graphs shown earlier this afternoon. Next slide. And I mentioned this in the last hearing. If we look at the decline of smoking prevalence in Japan over the past 20 years or so, 25 years, the rate has actually not increased with the introduction of heated tobacco products. So there are other reasons why people are stopping smoking in Japan. Next slide. In the UK, these are the quit attempts using e-cigarettes in the orange line. And you see that in 2012, 2013, there was a huge spike and people were starting to use e-cigarettes for quitting smoking. But if we look at the blue line, which is the monthly adult smoking rates, they're not actually declining at the same rate. They're declining at the same rate as they were even before e-cigarettes were introduced. Next slide. So what can we say to explain why smoking is still declining in the UK, for example? Well, price is one reason. Prices of cigarettes in the UK are very, very expensive. And so there's a better correlation with the increase in prices with the decline in smoking in the UK. Next slide. And I mention this because Juul is available from Shopee online at a price of 250 to 689 pesos. So earlier, Senator Drilon showed us the starter kit of Juul, which is available in the mall for 1,600 pesos. This is the device plus 2 pods. This selling online is for the device plus 4 pods. And it is half the price of what you can get in the mall if you buy it online. And
Just
you
to
know-
be clear, if you don't mind, this is not an authorized Juul product or sales activity, and it's not something that we do. This would be likely related to illicit trade, and it's something that we're very proactive in enforcing on.
Proactive about it.
Extremely proactive, yes.
So are you working with DTI or with NBI? Because you can easily get that out of the market if,
Yes, we have a global brand protection and trade compliance team that are active working with customs
that used
officials.
to be my practice before I became a senator, so you could have hired me 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Let me raise the legal issue, Madam Chair. Pricing is determined by the market. If the ball says this is 1,600 and the online shopping says it is 600, what can we really do?
From my practice in intellectual property law.
What will you do? I mean, we're a free society. The market determines the price. So I don't really know. These questions, I'm just using this earlier, 1,600, to debunk the theory that it is a deprivation of human rights. But, that is why I was, but I was wondering what's all of this discussion and saying this price is not authorized. So you don't have, it's the vendors look out how much the price is, not the company.
Let's just allow Dr. Yul to finish.
Just on that point, Madam Chair, the tobacco industry often says that we shouldn't raise taxes on cigarettes because it will increase illicit trade. But the reality is, majority of the illicit product that is in the black market is actually genuine product. There's very little counterfeit. So I would surmise that possibly these products are also not counterfeit, but could be entering the black market because of poor controls of the supply chain.
Senator, I would fundamentally disagree with that statement. We have proactively raided Chinese factories that have, immense counterfeit operations. What he said is not true.
We can ask DOF. I don't know if Yusek Carl has the figures, but under DOF, there must be somebody who has those figures now on the illicit trade, just for the record. Would you know offhand?
Madam Chair, not for this new product because we are just seeing them in recent months. But for the illicit tobacco, we have a mix. So we are proactively going after them. And the Mighty case is the biggest one that we have caught. Thank you.
So, Madam Chair, if I can just sum up then in the next slide. What we are asking for is for our policymakers to decide policies based on the precautionary principle. And this is because the scientific evidence, which means long-term valid studies done independently, not by the industry, because I remember Professor Pang saying we should start on unbiased evidence, right? Then we should look at the third-party evidence. The evidence is not sufficient. It's not conclusive at this time, but there is already clear evidence of harm, and therefore we should really be implementing policies based on precaution. Next slide. And one of these, of course, is with regard to tax regulation. We do not believe that replacing one harmful product with another harmful product is the way to go. In fact, if we look at the history of cigarettes, it took decades before the scientific community actually said that cigarettes were harmful, and that's why they are in the market up to now. And that was also because the tobacco industry hid the harms from us. But this means that if we are starting to see harms just less than 10 years from the time that these new products are on the market, we're actually seeing accelerated harm. So this is not the way we should be promoting harm reduction, because it's actually harm replacement. And so we recommend that all these products should be taxed quite similarly, particularly heated tobacco products and also ENDS similar to other tobacco products. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Let me now call on Dr. Tony Dance.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good evening, everyone. So my main purpose tonight is to present to you the latest national survey on e-cigarette use in the country, done by the Food and Nutrition Research Institute. But I'd like to leave that for the last slide and hang on to your excitement to be able to say a few words on the proceedings so far. So I'm Dr. Tony Dance from the UP College of Medicine. I'm an academician at the National Academy of Science and Technology. I have no financial conflicts of interest with regards this issue, but I have intellectual conflicts of interest as one of the founding leaders of the Syntax Coalition. So the key word, it seems, key phrase in this discussion has been harm reduction, where we address e-cigarettes as a possible step down from tobacco or an exit door sometimes from tobacco use. But I think we will come to better agreement if we also recognize that there is a potential for harm increase, and I'm not talking about biologic chemical reactions. I'm talking about it can also be the entrance to tobacco and use of other substances. So it's like a two-way street. So smokers can stop, but non-smokers might also be able to begin smoking. And I'd like to examine the evidence regarding that, and starting with harm reduction. Now, there have been a lot of statements about harm reduction, but I think we need to be clear about what we're actually doing. There are three ways that we administer e-cigarettes to users. One is through casual use, so we just sell and make it available. The other is through prescriptions, so we prescribe it to smokers. And the third is a combination, prescribe and intense counseling. And I recently reviewed the data on this. If you look at casual use, putting it in a market, hoping that smokers will use it, this is one of the several studies cited in today and in previous hearings, study by Steclosa in Japan on showing that introduction of e-cigarettes, actually that's the two vertical lines there, led to a decline in per capita cigarette sales. And I think we should stop citing these studies and saying that they're not evidence of causation, because they're just confusing us. No? This is the poorest evidence for correlation. No? Madam Chair, if I may, just a cartoon to drive home the point. No? From Dilbert, my favorite cartoon, sabi. One friend of Dilbert said, someday I want to get married because studies show that married people are happier. And Dilbert says, a smarter interpretation is that no one wants to marry an unhappy person. So it's really the poorest evidence when you just show correlation, and it's very confusing when we do that. Here's an example from the literature, the relationship between ice cream sales and polio rates in the 1950s. And public health officials declared that the polio epidemic in the 50s was due to ice cream and moved for the banning of ice cream, only to find out that it was not ice cream. It's in fact the seasonal variation in polio, happens to be in the summer and coincides with sales of ice cream. Imagine what a tragedy it would have been if ice cream was banned, no, for all of us. Let's just skip that discussion. Casually making the the e-cigarettes available in malls will not reduce tobacco use, and there is no convincing evidence for that. Now, it's a little different. We're talking of prescriptions. So I looked up the most recent meta-analysis on prescriptions for e-cigarettes to current smokers. I could bother you with this technical stuff, but I tried to simplify the presentation. How many
We
people...
like the cartoons.
Yeah, easier to understand. So, when you compare e-cigarettes versus electronically administered placebo, there were 2 trials in 662 patients. And if you look at the number who stopped in the e-cigarette group, it was 9% compared to 4% in the nicotine replacement group. No? And this was of borderline statistical significance. So you can see that, in fact, prescription can increase cessation a bit. Okay, but there are some caveats to that, which I'll point out later. If you look at e-cigarettes versus nicotine replacement tablets, there's one trial showing that there's no added advantage of e-cigarettes to nicotine replacement tablets. So 7% of the e-cigarette group stopped compared to 6%. This could have happened by chance. The conclusion of the authors, there's evidence from 2 trials that e-cigarettes help smokers to stop in the long term compared with placebo. However, the small number of trials, low event rates, and wide confidence intervals mean that our confidence in this result is rated low. And then the last level and the most recent is counseling prescription with intense counseling. And there's a big or a relatively good randomized trial. I'll show you the result. They randomized patients to 438 to the e-cigarette group and 446 to nicotine replacement therapy. And I'll show you how many stopped cigarettes in 1 year. 18% in the e-cigarette group compared to only 10% in nicotine replacement therapy. So e-cigarettes was superior, and this was statistically significant. And here's the caveat. At the end of that year, many of those on e-cigarettes were still on e-cigarettes, 63 of the 79. While on nicotine replacement therapy, only 4 were still needing the replacement therapy to keep away from tobacco. So now if you count the number who stopped any form of cigarette, there's only 79 minus 63, 16 in the e-cigarette group and 40 in the nicotine replacement group. So in fact, it was harder to kick nicotine when you were given e-cigarettes. And the p-value here is my p-value based on statistical analysis against highly significant statistically. Note that this potential to work only happened with multi-session behavioral support, including weekly one-on-one sessions with local clinicians, monitored expired carbon monoxide levels, and contact by telephone at 26 and 52 weeks. So, casual use, no evidence. Effectiveness by prescription, doubtful. Even prescription with intense behavioral support, questionable use. So I'll go quickly now to harm increase. And 3 things in the recent literature: exposure to advertisements, actual use of e-cigarettes, and even marijuana use. So a trial by Vasiljevic et al. Published last year showed that children exposed to e-cigarette advertisements perceived the harms of occasional smoking to be lower than those in the control group. So this is called the normalization of their perception of smoking when they see advertisements on e-cigarettes. Actual use, study by Zhong et al. Showed And the slide has stopped. So 6 studies, this is a meta-analysis with 91,000 participants. Among never smoking adolescents and young adults, e-cigarette use was associated with a increased smoking intention. It doubled the possibility that they would think of the possibility of smoking. And here's a recent study, 2019, by Chadi et al., the association between e-cigarette use and marijuana use among adolescents, showing the odds of marijuana use were higher in youth who had an e-cigarette use history versus those who did not. So if you use e-cigarettes, there's a threefold use in marijuana use. And lastly, now the FNRI data used by children and young adults in the Philippines. And this is very interesting. So this is a 2-stage cluster sample across the country involving 81 provinces, 33 households, household sampling units. Next. So the total number of individuals studied here was 159,000. This survey is now going to be done yearly. So we're going to have yearly updates on smoking, alcohol, e-cigarettes, etc. Next. And this is what the study showed. First, let's look at regular cigarettes. Next. If you look at regular cigarettes, the prevalence in, hold on, okay, is 20%, 19.8% in adults age 20 or more, and in young kids and young adults, 4%. Next. If you multiply that by the population size of those age groups, you'll see, next, that there are 12 million, 12 million users, 20 and above, and 800,000 young users of regular cigarettes, showing that, next, only 6% of current smokers are young. Next, please. If you look at electronic cigarettes, same data, the prevalences are much lower. It's 0.2 and 0.1% respectively. And if you multiply that by the same sample sizes of the population, next, you're going to see that there are 120,000 more or less adult smokers compared to 28,000 young e-cigarette users. And that relative proportion is 20% of e-cigarette users are in the age group 10 to 19 years old. That's 19% is more than threefold increase compared to regular cigarettes. So e-smokers are 3 times more likely to be young than smokers of regular cigarettes. And I think that's a huge potential harm. And I'm happy that it was acknowledged as a problem by the industry and something that needs to be addressed. Next. So in summary, it's a two-way street. If you accept harm reduction, that e-cigarettes is a potential step down or exit, you need to accept it's also a potential entrance or step up. Otherwise, if we ignore the problem, we can't do anything about it. Harm reduction, to summarize, no credible evidence that casual use will reduce use of regular cigarettes. Weak evidence that it's better, that e-cigarettes are better than available therapy, such as nicotine replacement. And fair evidence on effectiveness with intense behavioral modification. But more users continue to be nicotine dependent. Next, summary on the negative side, there's good evidence that e-cigs, advertisements, normalize smoking among children. Good evidence that e-cigarettes can lead to regular cigarette use. And 3, fair evidence that e-cigarettes can lead to marijuana use. Lastly, as the FNRI data show, 1 of 5 e-cigarette users in the country are aged 19 or less. And in the same way that less toxic substances can be a form of harm reduction, we believe that taxation is also a form of harm reduction. On the left side, you have to recognize that harm reduction is not only on the right here. Harm reduction is also controlling the potential increase in risk from use of e-cigarettes. And if we don't recognize that, we miss the chance to get a handle on it. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Tony Dance. May I now call on... Oh, I'm sorry. I was just reminded that I have not acknowledged the presence of Senator Amy Marcos and Senator Francis Tolentino. My apologies. I saw you there. I was so engrossed in the presentation, but your presence is now physically noted by the chair, even though everyone has seen you. Meron? Okay ka na? Yes?
Okay lang, Madam
You'd
Chair.
like, yes, please proceed.
Just dropped by because I was watching the proceedings over our closed circuit television. I couldn't help but share some insights. 22 days ago, or 23 days ago, I was looking for some news relative to Brexit. I glanced upon a television interview over BBC of Philip Morris Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Kalantzopoulos, probably a Greek, familiar with him. This probably would relate to some interesting questions you can answer internally.
It seems to be your...
Let me, who was interrupting? Let me continue this first, Madam Chair. That was the Greek president of Philip Morris. So it's very interesting, Madam Chair, because practically in that interview, the president of Philip Morris International apologized to all cigarette smokers. And he practically promised, if my memory would serve me right, that within 5 years, Philip Morris will cease operating as a cigarette manufacturing company. If I may quote this, he said, cigarette sales, and I quote, cigarette sales are declining everywhere in the world, and we are going to accelerate this decline, unquote. Andrei Kalantzopoulos told BBC's Hard Talk's Stephen Sakur. Mr. Kalantzopoulos, can't pronounce this. I'm from Cavite. Mr. Kalantzopoulos said his objective is to focus on their new alternative products and get rid of cigarettes. And they can achieve this very quickly if governments and regulators will help Philip Morris. So what I'm saying is this, Madam Chair. If this is true, and I have the video presentation, probably I will consume so much time of this committee, I'll just turn this over to the good committee chair who's been handling this committee ably. Will this, asking the president of JUUL, will this practically, in your opinion, open the market floodgates for new products that would take the place of Philip Morris? And would our DOH personnel here accept that we're now facing a new front? It's no longer your regular cigarette manufacturing companies, but the alternatives. But for us, for me, a non-smoker, this is a good news because if this is true, Philip Morris will no longer be in operation within 5 years. So, Madam Chair, magagalit sa akin si Amy kasi she hails from a tobacco-producing company. So, no, province.
Country.
Province.
The Ilocano nation.
Province. I'm sorry. I'm not a non-smoker. Probably that's the effect. So, are we now in effect trying to, with this committee, we're looking at taxation, looking forward that we're seeing a future wherein cigarette sales would decline. And then we're confronted with another front, an area, a sphere not yet regulated, being sold online, whose effects, that's the picture of, can we have that, Kalantzopoulos, that's the video. You can have that, Madam Chair. So are we saying now that what we are saying, what we are discussing,
To address the moral issues behind
oh, that's the face of the guy. He can speak later. Let me continue, Mr. Kalantzopoulos. Are we now saying that what we're discussing here are not just speculative, because Philip Morris has made, if this is a commitment, or what I'm trying to say is the one that is speculative?
But absolutely not logical. Because if Philip Morris stops selling cigarettes tomorrow, do you think people will stop smoking, or that would help public health? Somebody else would
I
sell
think
it.
it would have a massive impact on the global debate about the future of smoking. You could tell me that other companies would fill in behind you, that they would take your business. That in the short run may be true, but imagine if you showed the leadership to say, you know what, my rhetoric about a smoke-free future isn't just words. We, tomorrow, are going to stop making cigarettes. Just imagine how powerful that would be.
Our objective is to phase out cigarettes.
Yeah. Can we cut that? Can we cut that? Because he might say some more. Comsec, can we cut that?
Cut na daw, please.
So,
Okay.
so internally, probably, Madam Chair, they can answer, they can rephrase what they're going to say today, their statements mentioned a while ago. My point is this. If this guy is telling the truth, and probably it will happen, so we will have new products, probably your product, probably another cigarette manufacturing company. So it augurs well for the health sector, because we're trying to limit, but I don't agree with the use of your precautionary principle. Precautionary principle is different from precautionary approach. It's more related to environmental laws, no offense. So what I'm driving at is this. If this is true, some of the assumptions you're saying right now probably might not be true. Probably some of the assumptions being just related by the health sector are most probably correct if this guy would commit to phase out Philip Morris in 5 years. So just my point of discussion, Madam Chair. I just can't resist watching you on closed circuit television that something should not be left unsaid, especially coming from the Philip Morris head himself. Thank you, Madam Chair, for that piece.
Thank you, Senator Tolentino. Actually, we have the local representative of Philip Morris here, Mr. Patrick Mutart, and he was raising his hand. So, Mr. Patrick,
Mr.
please.
Patrick, before you say a piece, I recall that Philip Morris sued me before when I initiated a no smoking drive for Metro Manila. But that's beside the point. I got a TRO when I was Metro Manila chairman. I tried to implement what Mayor Duterte was implementing in Davao, but I got sued. I got a TRO from a Mandaluyong regional trial court judge who more often than not would recess the hearings because he would go on a smoking binge. No offense, Mr. Motard.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for highlighting Mr. Kalantzopoulos' quote from BBC. Look, this is the corporate position. Our CEO is serious about it. We are serious about it. The message is very, very clear. If you don't smoke, don't start. If you do smoke, quit. If you can't quit, change. And what we find is that quitting rates are very, very low in this country and around the world, about 4% per year. And what we have found is with products, smoke-free products like heated tobacco, like e-vapor, we're seeing increases in the amount of consumers who are able to successfully get off cigarettes. With heated tobacco, the rates are around 70%. So this is the new corporate strategy. It is the objective. As I mentioned last week, 92% of our R&D spending is now being focused on smoke-free products, not on traditional cigarettes, and the goal is to get out of the cigarette business as quickly as possible, but we need our consumers to be with us to make that happen.
Chair, given the chance to question Mr. Motard, you're affirming what the PMI president said in that videotape interview with BBC, that eventually Philip Morris would be phased out, would close, would cease operations?
The company is seeking to transform itself into a company that works exclusively in the business of smoke-free products. So if you go to the PMI website right now, the question's on the homepage: how long will Philip Morris be in the cigarette business? And the goal of our CEO, the goal of all of us, is to get us out of the cigarette business as quickly as possible, and for those who would continue to smoke, or otherwise continue to smoke, to
And,
give them the
I
opportunity of
understand.
switching.
So smoke-free products would mean non-tobacco related products.
They would mean products which eliminate combustion, which is the core cause of smoking-related diseases and illnesses. So it's taking the smoke out of smoking, so to speak. So it's products like heated tobacco, it's products like e-vapor, it's products like smoke-free oral tobacco.
With your permission,
Non-combustible.
Madam Chair, may I ask Yusek Chua if the products mentioned by Mr. Motard is part of your tax measures, non-smoke products? Probably Philip Morris would have their own Philip Morris hamburgers. Will that be?
Okay, I think, Madam Chair, Senator, they are referring to the heated tobacco product, which does not emit smoke, but still has the same tobacco as the basis. The other product are vapes that for instance, the Juul are marketing. So these
you.
are similar products, to our opinion.
I will share with Senator Tolentino the presentation, the joint presentation of DOF and DOH that explains the products, which are sold by the two major companies that are present here today, Philip Morris and Juul. Senator Marcos, please.
Yes, Madam Chair, I just came over following certain requests from a certain Dr. Asunta Mendoza, who apparently had a paper to present. She's an expert from Manila Medical Center, but I think she has been delayed, so she will leave with the committee secretary, and I hope she'll be given the opportunity to present. Given the paucity of local data, I'm certain that that will contribute to the discussion. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, Yusek.
Madam Chair, yeah, just a very short comment from Senator Tolentino, just a takeoff. But that's exactly the fear of the Department of Health, that we're just changing one epidemic with another epidemic. That is exactly why we want them taxed exactly the same as tobacco products, and we want these new products regulated. And I'm inviting all the companies here. The administrative order of the FDA to regulate ENNDS has been out, and we're ready to implement. And by next week, we are ready to accept applications for registration. So please, I mean, if there was any goodwill on the side of the industry, then please submit yourselves to regulation.
And well, this is not yet, I checked, this is not officially a joint hearing of the Committee on Health and Ways and Means, but I am the Vice Chair of the Committee on Health. And I do also support the call of Yusek Domingo that when I spoke to industries and in the statement that I've made it very clear that we appreciate the industries that work with government, that self-regulate, and in the interest of ensuring the safety and the proper regulation, I do encourage you to comply and to meet with DOH for whatever concerns. But on that note, can we go on now so that we can proceed with our various resource persons who have yet to call? Next on my list is Dr. Cory Avancenia, Philippine Pediatric Society.
Yes.
Sorry. Now? Sorry. Sorry, Doctora. I am told I am reading the wrong list. Yan kaya yung list niyo. Okay. I'm sorry. Number 3 pala si Dr. Cory. Is Dr. Cory or Doctora? Dr. Cory. Yes. Sorry. Number 2, Dr. Tony Dance. I know now because they started. They said number 1 si Dr. Tony Dance and number 1 ka. Kaya nalito ako sa numbering. Yun lang. I had to explain. So now we are on Dr. Tony Lechon to be followed by Dr. Cory Avancenia. Please proceed.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair.
Gabi na. Good evening na.
Good evening. If I have my first slide, please. Just for introduction, I'm a cardiologist by profession. I worked with PhilHealth before, and if Malcolm Gladwell said that an expert is 10,000 hours, I'm exposed to about 200,000 hours and seeing 30 patients per day. And I had a dad who died of liver cancer. He used to smoke and drink. My mom was exposed also, died of breast cancer. My sister also exposed to smoking. And I have 2 brothers on e-cigarettes right now, and there's no hope in the horizon that they would stop. And therefore, I'm considered an expert as well as considering also the research output of Dr. Dance. Just a few summary of the presentation. This will be a short one. Next slide. Well, it has been positioned that e-cigarettes are marketed as less harmful than cigarettes, but they are still harmful. Basically, because of the nicotine content, which is actually a vasoconstriction causing coronary artery disease and stroke. They may not have the tar causing the cancer, but still as dangerous to any human being. Next slide. Now, the common e-cigarette chemical flavorings may impair lung function. This I just used 2 Harvard studies, and basically they actually impair the cilia function, which is responsible also for causing the chronic lung disease and asthma. Now, the next slide would be very interesting. Next slide. This is from Harvard again. The studies have found that a diacetyl flavoring chemical in e-cigarette is unsafe when heated because it has been linked with severe and irreversible lung disease called obliterative bronchiolitis, according to Professor Allen. And this disease is also known as a popcorn lung because it was found in workers to have explosion, and this may actually lead to a lot of problems. So e-cigarettes are safer than cigarettes. There's no question about it. But safer does not mean safe, and all e-cigarette users need to be informed about the risk of inhaling these chemicals. Next slide. Now, while e-cigarettes may be marketed as safer and traditional, they are still not safe based on the studies presented by Dr. Yule and Dr. Dance. Next slide. Now, my main concern is basically on the universal health care. According to the Department of Finance, the funding gap for UH is 63 billion. Though the heated tobacco products and vapor products may only comprise 4.3%. But if we really up to the challenge of having universal health care, we must address shaping the environment. We would like to address, of course, ignorance. We would like to, of course, regulate and, of course, reduce tobacco or nicotine addiction by coercion or by regulation. But if we want, of course, universal healthcare, we cannot actually achieve that if we will just spend so much on field health without actually reducing smoking addiction. So this is my main point. My main point is actually shaping the environment and basically to increase the taxes for those tobacco as well as tobacco-like products. Next slide. Now, if you can see here, in 2012, the first sin tax law was passed, and it has actually reduced, of course, the prevalence of smoking to 20%, and of course, quadrupled or perhaps quintupled the sin taxes given to PhilHealth and the Department of Health. But I don't think that the technology and innovation, as mentioned by Senator Tolentino, they're just shifting the problem right now to another one because the behavior is still there. They can step up again to smoking. They're positioning this to step down. But based on my clinical experience, seeing a lot of patients, they don't really stop smoking in the first place. And they're exposed to other metabolic problems, considering they will smoke and they can actually drink alcohol and develop a lot of complications related to the metabolic syndrome. Last two slides. Now, we had this extensive discussion on Juul. Well, they said that it's safe, but my main problem is not the tar. My concern is about nicotine, which is highly addicting and can harm the young ones, which will be the future of this country. And that will be a sad thing considering they'll be spending more right now since they're starting their careers and have early medical problems in the long run. Next slide.
Senator, I would just like to point out that those are not Juul marketing materials. We didn't create those materials, the images that you saw.
Well, I'd just like to reiterate what I read, but I'd like to emphasize that we got this particular news item as you presented this earlier in your opening statement about the warning of the FDA.
But you were referring to the previous slide, right?
Yes, in the previous slide,
Yeah.
the imagery that you saw
Yes,
around
that's
Juul,
not
that
Juul.
is not
Okay,
Juul
for the
created
record,
materials.
yes.
Yeah, for the record, yeah.
That one, but you are now talking about your next slide.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
So basically, the US FDA is alarmed as well right now that there's a problem with marketing this to children. And next slide. And they are compelled, based on the data presented also. The company has 15 days to respond to the FDA, the detailed steps in order to address this problem. Now, as presented by Yusek Eric, there is an administrative report order issued June 14, 2009. Now, perhaps we can talk all day, but I think the regulation is important, and that is the FDA, and this was signed by Secretary Duque. The available studies are not enough to clearly conclude the long-term use of ENDS and other products and may have harmful effects to human health. And no establishment shall engage in the manufacture, distribution, and importation and transfer of these products without first securing the necessary marketing authorization. So what I'm trying to say is that this is the time right now to step up, considering right now the spate of deaths abroad, and of course, some may be underestimated actually in our country. Next slide. So the FDA asked the DOH to report cases of illnesses and injuries related to the e-cigarettes. And with this particular administrative order, it's imperative right now that we report this to reduce public harm. Next slide. This is my final statement. I'm given 2 minutes. So the rising trend in the use of e-cigarette and heated tobacco products has also been very alarming. There is an ongoing public narrative that these are harm-reducing products that can be viable alternatives to traditional cigarettes. We beg to differ. Globally, a lot of scientific studies have to be done in order to arrive at such conclusion. Given the products also contain harmful chemicals like nicotine, there must be regulation as well as increase in taxation, considering the harm it can actually do to the youngsters and, of course, the Filipino health in general. So with that, Madam Chair, I'm submitting my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'll call on Dr. Cory Avencena to be followed by...
Madam Chair, will we have an opportunity to respond to the comments from the public health community at some point in the hearing?
Are we not going to have dinner anymore? We can just be more efficient with time. Take note of your concerns, and I'll let you respond attend. But, feel free to point out who was the person who said it, so I can also
Yeah.
follow the conversation. But just in the interest of time, let's do it per group, okay?
Understood, thank you.
Okay. Dr. Lynn Panganiban.
Yes. Good evening. I'm a general pediatrician and a pediatric pulmonologist, so I am representing the Philippine Pediatric Society. This is just to put on record that our brain, it doesn't fully mature until we are in our mid-20s. So exposure to nicotine early will affect this development. So this part of the brain is like where we get to have like our decision making, our behavior. So early exposure to nicotine will affect this. And that's the reason why like my other colleagues were mentioning that if you start early, then later on you will shift to a regular cigarette. So they are right about nicotine being addictive, but then it's the tar that will kill you and the other chemicals included in the cigarette. So I grew up with my dad saying, I don't care if you smoke, just don't burn my money. And be that as it may, if you increase tax, it will curb the younger people from buying cigarettes because they would rather spend their money for their load or for other things rather than cigarette or their e-cigarettes. That's it.
Again, for the record, you representing the Philippine Pediatric Society, I want to reiterate that the image in my mind is young people, and like I said, not necessarily 18. I fully support, again, no medical background whatsoever, but as a mother, I ensure that my children who are still both under 25 know the study I read that the brain keeps on developing until
Yes.
mid-20s. Therefore, I will still dictate on what they do. And
True.
they, as I told you, they have said that every evening out with among young people now includes sitting beside somebody who will use an e-cig or an HTP. So
Correct.
that is the reality that people like my daughters who spent a life in sports now have to deal with.
True. And actually, you are seen by a pediatrician before your 19th birthday.
Before your 19th.
Before your 19th birthday. So they are actually selling still to our patients because
Well, go ahead.
because up to 18 years old, right, they can buy cigarettes.
Yes.
So they still fall under our care.
Well, and on that note, though, and for those of us who are blessed economically to have pediatricians as opposed to having to just go to a health center, sometimes there are no pediatricians. So I
Yes.
consider that already a blessing that my children can go to a pediatrician. Many of them, and I'm not the only one, still their children, with or without their parents' consent, are comfortable still going to their pediatrician in their 20s. And
Correct.
thankfully, many of their pediatricians don't turn them away.
Yes.
So
Like
that's
our
why I would
mentor?
like to redefine that because
Correct.
honestly, a lot of them in 21, 22, 23, they grew up with these pediatricians, so they're happy and they know their history. So it's more like it becomes more like family med
Yes,
in
because
that sense.
some of my mentors, their patients, they're already handling the daughters and sons of their patients. So, true. And even I, like my patients, the parents would ask for my advice regarding those things. And to think that because they get the consultation for free. Like they're with their pediatrician, they're asking their kids to be seen, and ay, doktora, ako rin, I'm sick. And then, so we can also get to advise them.
On that note, for another hearing, probably more under the Committee on Health, but I would love to work with Philippine Pediatric Society to ask you for you to enlighten us also on what doctors are doing now that they know that the interventions have to come earlier. Because I just on another note, for the info of everyone, but maybe Yusek, Carlin, Yusek, Rolly Domingo, I chair the committee on, I chair the hearing of the budget for DepEd, and one of the agencies under DepEd or aligned with DepEd, the Children's Television, attached agencies, Children Television. So I am asking them what are their interventions on public in TV. So maybe we can work we can ask the health sector to work with us on this, because from breastfeeding to anti-smoking to environmental concerns, all of this information are fed, go in and out of the ears and eyes of the kids who sit in front of the televisions. And for the record, is it the rule or is it the law that says that the child-friendly hours are 8 to 12 and then 2 to 5? But as my staff correctly pointed out to them, but children are in especially homes that may only have one television, they're probably watching until their bedtime along with their parents, so till 7, till 8, till 9. So all of these advocacies that we have, we should be able, I think it goes back to Dr. Dan's, I like the Sesame Street directional visual, where we can also approach it on what else can we do to reduce the harm that's already being done. So anyway, for another hearing.
Actually, because in my Philippine Academy of Pediatric Pulmonologists, we lecture to lay. And in our lectures, because as I was saying, my dad said, I don't care if you smoke, just don't burn my money. But now what we teach is not one puff ever. Nope. Because as we said, it's the nicotine. So isn't it your first puff, you cough, it's not pleasant. But it's because of the nicotine that will make you want to try it again and again. Because after that, there's like a good feeling when you puff. And then when it wanes, you start to feel low, so you want it again. So that's the one that makes you want to smoke. So what we teach is not one puff ever. And we lecture to lay people. But it would be nice if we could, as you were saying, if we could partner with media and schools. So we tried, but not enough, I guess.
File a resolution and we'll hear it in the Committee on Health.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, let's proceed. So next is Dr. Lynn Panganiban, followed by Mr. R.J. Mercado.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Dr. Lynn Panganiban. I'm the president of the Philippine Society of Clinical and Occupational Toxicology. At the same time, I also teach at the UP College of Medicine at the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology, and I'm a consultant at the National Poison Management and Control Center. I think we have agreed around this table that we're dealing with a substance that by itself is harmful. But maybe there's some discussion and as far as the degree of how harmful these chemicals are. Now, the effects that we are seeing at this time, which we would want to raise as our point as toxicologists, is that the effects are very much dependent on how we handle the chemicals in our body. So for instance, as far as absorption, I know our doctor from Canada earlier in a slide showed that as far as pulmonary absorption of nicotine, both e-cigarette and whether it's a regular cigarette, there's an amount of absorption. And he showed in his slide that you see that there's a relatively lower absorption when it comes to e-cigarette, the nicotine in e-cigarette and that of the regular cigarette. However, when you talk about absorption, it's also we have to consider in terms of the rapid delivery of that particular substance like nicotine into the target organ. And therefore, even in the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, in their report in 2018, they saw that when you look at cigarette, the combustible tobacco cigarette, and that of nicotine, the profile in terms of their levels of nicotine are still comparable. And therefore, at the end, when you look at its psychoactive effect, will also be, that will be produced, what we will expect will also be the same. And maybe that's where I will follow through with what Dr. Dance was saying, that in the studies, at the end of the day, the nicotine dependence still remains. It's because the levels are still the same. So that's as far as absorption. Also, one other thing when we're talking about how we handle nicotine in the body, which is now maybe the chemical at point we're looking at, is that it is distributed in many other organ systems. Last hearing, we were talking about secondhand smoke. Although we were saying that advertisement or advocacy saying that we have to limit the use of e-cigarettes to women, not to be used by women of reproductive age group. But the secondhand smoke by itself will also make these women be vulnerable and will also be exposed to nicotine, and at the same time will harm the developing fetus because nicotine by itself also crosses the placenta. Now, in terms again, the other aspect when we talk
Second-hand smoke.
the secondhand smoke, which
Would
means that whatever there is in the environment, and then it gets into the system,
Of
gets
the
into the
pregnant
body of a
mother.
pregnant mother,
So that would
that
affect.
nicotine by itself can cross the placental barrier and by itself can again affect the developing fetus. Now, the other aspect, just to complete what we call the kinetic aspect, which is of course how we handle the chemical, is how it is broken down. Now, nicotine is being broken down up by a particular enzyme. And maybe what we would want to stress here is that there are substances or chemicals that are mixed with nicotine. And I know people have been saying about flavorant. One thing that the study, in fact, there are studies that would show that menthol, if you're going to mix nicotine with menthol, it will by itself, menthol by itself will inhibit the breakdown of your nicotine. So what will be the effect? There's going to be a consistency in terms of the levels of nicotine in your system, and by itself will enhance the toxic effects of nicotine. So again, the matter of what will be that particular flavorant that is going to be mixed, if ever it's going to be regulated, etc., will matter. So there was talk earlier about what would it be? Will mango, will mint by itself? So those adjuvants, or what we call rather flavorants by themselves, will also affect how nicotine is being broken down. So in other words, so when we talk about all this, we also have to determine how every individual will handle this particular substance, which is nicotine in the body, and the end of the day will also enhance its toxic effects. So that's all, Madam Chair. Thank you.
FYI, everyone, I don't wear a watch. So I was trying not to be too time conscious to give you all. I hope you appreciate the time that we're putting in here. So my staff had to remind me what time it is, and I do have a dinner engagement. So what we will do is that since we have finished the health advocates, we will stop the presentations now. So the others that I called on earlier will give you the time to present later on. I'm not later on in the next hearing. And then because our representative from Jewel is not, Mr. Kenneth Bishop is not from here, I will give you a few minutes on your tax issue, the tax information that you want to share with us. And then I will also give a few minutes to Mr. Patrick Mutart, although you are from here, but I said that I will recognize. So I hope none of you will go back and say you don't have time to say whatever you want to say because you have a lot of time. But I also have to remind everyone that not just because you have something to say that everybody will get a chance to say. So I hope you appreciate the time that you have because we can't keep hearing the same song also. So there are other people who ask to be heard, and my staff has to very carefully curate this so that we all can, move on and I can come up with a committee report in due time, okay? So, Mr. Bishop, the floor is yours for a few minutes.
Thank you, Senator. You've been very generous with our time allocation. I appreciate that. In response to some of the arguments that have been made, I want to make a point that technology is changing the world and disrupting every industry that's out there. Tobacco is still the leading cause of disease, and after years and years and years of tobacco control efforts that are being described here today, it is still a problem. There are still 1 billion smokers around the world and 16 million smokers in the Philippines. We are not a tobacco company. We are a technology company that wants to solve this problem. All the problems that are described, we want to address with our products. Now, a number of the things that were mentioned, the product risks like explosions, diacetyl, deaths related to THC and vitamin E, seizures, these simply don't apply equally to all products. They don't apply equally to us, and they can and should be addressed with regulations, not tax. And with the science that was presented, there are independent, objective studies around toxicology, behavioral, and clinical that offer very strong counterpoints to everything that you saw here today. We shared some, but there are many more. So with that, I want to point out that we're here to talk about tax, and I do have some data to share with you about global tax policies. Now, what we've done is we've engaged a Big Four tax organization to compile some information for us around global tax policies around the world. About 162 countries permit the sale of ENDS, and around 133 of these do not have ENDS-specific excise taxes. So for example, UK, Germany, France, Spain, and New Zealand do not have an ENDS-specific excise tax. And if you go to the next slide. Furthermore, in the EU, which we view as a strong regulatory example for the category, only 9 of the 28 European Union countries have applied excise tax. There is a European Commission report that came out late last year, and you can see here highlighted at the bottom, they say from a health perspective, a cautious approach should be adopted towards a potential harmonized taxation of e-cigarettes. They recognize the debate around the science, and they are recommending that their member states take a cautious approach not to harmonize the tax. And that's what we would recommend here. In fact, there are a number of EU countries that have reduced the tax in recognition of the potential health impact of these products, including Italy, which reduced their tax in December of last year, 7, 8, 9 months ago. Now, our understanding right now is that there is a current tax bill that has been approved or put into law. That's RA 11346. There's a proposed House bill, and then there's a proposal from the DOF and the DOH. This is a very visual summary of what our understanding is of what's on the table. Now, what we have done is we have taken information from jurisdictions around the world, if you go to the next slide, and we are comparing these tax rates to other countries. And what we're showing here is the ENDS tax in relation to the tax on combustible cigarettes. Again, Big Four accounting firm compiling real taxation data. And what you can see here is that the proposed tax rates would put Philippines as an outlier in the global taxation system as it relates to ENDS. And there are no countries in the world that we are aware of, and we've done good research, that have a 1-to-1 ratio of tax on ENDS to combustible cigarettes. And we believe this is a recognition of policymakers viewing the potential of technology to solve this epidemic of combustible cigarettes. Now, furthermore, if you adjust this based on affordability of these products, we talked a lot about affordability with Senator Drilon? Sorry. And this is a really important point. If you look at affordability adjusted to net income of Filipinos, you can see that the taxes that have been proposed would further put Philippines in an outlying situation. And this would advantage combustible cigarettes and significantly disadvantage alternatives to those combustible cigarettes. Now, prices are really important. Right now, the unit economics and the cost structures of cigarette companies and new technologies are very different. There's already a very big price difference. You can see the price difference in green. And if these taxes pass, it would further exacerbate those differences. We believe that if these differences are exacerbated, people will have less access to these products, and it will also increase illicit trade, and it will also advantage cigarettes as compared to alternatives. And so we have a few recommendations.
Continue. Can you just bring it back to that last slide? So this is based on the average retail price, correct?
That's correct.
So, but the bulk of the price here is the retail price, not the tax. So I don't think you can blame the tax for making it more expensive than the cigarette, correct? I just want to be sure that am I correct?
Senator, I would argue that the cigarette prices in the Philippines are some of the lowest in the world because the tax rates are the lowest in the world.
Before you explain, am I correct in my understanding? Can the health advocates, DOF, can you look behind me? Am I correct? That the basis, oh, you have a copy here, okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Okay. Anyway, but am I correct that if you look at the average retail price, the bulk of that price is the cost of the product. So if
Sure.
we were to take away the tax, if we don't even tax it, the difference between cigarette and a freebase and a nicotine salt is still going to be like that, correct?
Correct.
So that's my only point. Don't make it appear that it's taxation that's bringing the price up. The price of an e-cig and a vape is what it is because of the product.
You make a very fair point, and the graphs
Okay.
don't
Okay,
lie.
no, because I want to be responsible for whatever committee report I come out with. So if you're going to go around the world and says it's like this, that's not my fault. That's the product. That's all I want to say.
Correct.
And
but
then I will take responsibility for the committee report that I put out.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I would argue.
I just want to be clear because I might have missed something.
And I would argue that the discussion on increases in tax are focused on the wrong type of products. It shouldn't be focused on ends, it should be focused on combustible cigarettes. Okay.
Your comments are noted.
So,
But there's no tax recommendation that is higher than regular cigarettes. The most is that it's except for the per milliliter, right? There is a per milliliter
Correct.
recommendation of DOF.
so our understanding is the DOF is recommending a per milliliter on the nicotine salts or on nicotine in general. I don't think they discriminate to be taxed the exact same as a pack of cigarettes.
Yeah.
And that is unprecedented. That hasn't happened anywhere in the world.
Okay, noted.
Okay, so the next slide. So look, we've made a lot of points. This is our summary here. So we have some very humble recommendations and requests. We would request that you implement RA 11346 before any additional tax is levied. We believe that we need further evidence and further debate before we act further. We would ask that in new legislation, we focus on tax only. We would ask that there is no tax on the device, and we would ask that there's no discrimination between the types of nicotines, and we would ask that taxes on ends reflect the potential for harm reduction. And taking a step back, very similar to what we're doing here today, we believe that regulations and much more extensive regulations are needed in this category, and we believe that regulations will address many of the risks and concerns, which are very real, that you heard of today. And I want to just make sure that we identify that these risks are real, but not all products are the same, and regulations are a great mechanic for addressing those risks. Thank you.
Just a very quick comments. On your recommendation, taxation on end should reflect the potential for harm reduction. I agree. I agree with what you're saying. I accept that. But I think the counterpart of that should also be that it reflects the potential for more harm, for harm creation. Because I think that's what the health advocates keep on repeating. There's all this evidence of possible health risks that we're just beginning to understand. So there's also that, and I have to be honest with all of you. That's what my supposedly open-minded brain is trying to find the right balance for, and you recognize that. I have not really heard. I have to say I may be wrong, but I don't think I've really heard the industry recognize that reality, that there is still so much that we need to find out as to the harm that could be caused. I mean, obviously it is your mandate as a business to promote this as harm reduction. I understand that. But as a ethical business in the Philippines, I'm curious if you're open to saying that you are continually, and you recognize that there may be a lot of harm out in these products that you are still trying to address. And therefore, regulators like us can be cautious, should be cautious, because there are a lot of harm that I used to chair the Committee on Health before I chaired this committee, and we can never find enough funding for all the health-related nicotine and cigarette smoking-related illnesses that we have. And so here I am looking for funding for health concerns, and I'm being told to be cautious because it is supposedly harm reduction, but I don't hear anything from the industry saying yeah, you're right. We may also be creating harm. There
Senator,
doesn't seem to be any acknowledgement that I've heard of.
so I would acknowledge that there are certainly risks in the industry, and those should be addressed. And I think that there's a way to address those with both taxation and regulation. We are more than happy to pay tax and contribute to the economy in all types of ways. However, I would urge you to consider that our products and products like our products will address the fundamental issue of tobacco-related disease. The science needs to evolve. Our confidence in the information that's available needs to grow. We need to have debates and discussions like this, but I believe that innovation and technology will be a solution to a 1,000-year-old problem that has not been addressed with traditional efforts.
And on that note, I will be sure to invite you and all of you to my hearing in the newly formed committee, which I will chair. It is the Committee on Sustainable Development Goals, Innovation, and Future Thinking. So you are more than welcome to share your knowledge on health and industry, because that is, I think, the venue where we can have more discussions on this. You are right.
Absolutely.
I don't mind that you brought the discussion to taxation, but I will not, I feel that the discussion on health is a very big component, and that is why we've devoted so much time on the health issue, because to tax it at a rate equivalent to cigarette or to tax it less revolves around whether it's seriously harm reduction or not, and that's why 99% of the discussion is on health.
And that is, I'm in 100% alignment with that. I agree.
So, Mr. Patrick Mutart, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you for being so generous with your time. I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes responding to some of the comments that came from the organization SIADCA. There was a lot to unpack in that presentation. I don't have a lot of time, but I would like to. Yeah.
Happy to see it. It also give me more time to digest it. So if you could just highlight it instead of rushing through it.
Sure, just two key points. The first is that in the SIADCA presentation, it was suggested that the IQOS product is actually combustible, combusted. This is a really, really important issue, because absence of combustion in these products is central to their reduced risk profile. And this product was, it went through the most comprehensive review ever in the form of the US FDA PMTA review process. And the US FDA has issued a market authorization, a market order, which clearly defines the product as non-combusted. So just to correct the record.
I was going to ask you that, okay. And you can still feel free to, but just not now. You can tell me later, you can explain.
The second point is SIADCA made a number of claims about lack of evidence. And one of the reports that they highlighted to make this claim about lack of evidence was the report by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicines, a U.S. organization founded by the U.S. government which provides independent and objective advice. I actually have this report. It's 775 pages. And while it is true that the report highlights some concerns and makes the case that more research is required, I found it very interesting in the report's final observations. The organization, the Academy, said, nonetheless, the committee found sufficient literature to suggest that while there are risks associated with e-cigarettes, compared with combustible tobacco cigarettes, e-cigarettes contain fewer toxicants, can deliver nicotine in a manner similar to combustible tobacco cigarettes, show significantly less biological activity in a number of in vitro animal and human systems, and might be useful as a cessation aid in smokers who use e-cigarettes exclusively. I just wanted to put that on the record because I think the slide in SIADCA runs the risk of misleading the committee as to what the organization was trying to say. Thank you.
You're free to pull out portions, what I ask of everybody is give me the whole picture, because at the end of the day, we just make life difficult for our country if we have bits and pieces that a chairman like me doesn't understand, because I'm neither in the industry, I'm neither a health professional. So I really do appreciate all the input that you can give us. My staff requires that I read the names of the persons who we will hear next time, because we have to cut the lists here on. If there are any other groups, you are, as I said, welcome to submit your position paper. If you represent a group that has not been heard, because a lot are groups similar to other groups, if necessary, my staff can sit down with you to get the information, but I think a lot of the information that we need to hear is on the table. You're also welcome to go see Yusek Carl, because we will end up discussing what comes out of this hearing along with Yusek Rolly Domingo. Anyway, so Mr. Mercado, Mr. Akupan, and Attorney Nisperas, I apologize that we weren't able to accommodate you. Ganun talaga buhay. Anyway, what else? That's it? Our next hearing is on the 17th. What day is that? But wala pa akong time, di ba? Yes, unfortunately, I can't give you a time because I have two important engagements that I have to work around on that day. So it will either be a morning hearing around 10, or it will be similar to this, right? At 4:30. So 10 or 4:30. Hopefully, we'll make an announcement tomorrow. Dr. Yul, yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I won't be available next week, so if I could just make a couple of inputs for next week. Very, very short ones. I just wanted to
You're
put,
taking advantage of my generosity
thank
already,
you, Madam Chair.
Dr. Yul.
No, just for the record, because there was a discussion on taxation, there are other countries that tax e-cigarettes the same as other tobacco products. So,
Actually,
so it's not necessarily
yeah.
true that there.
I just didn't have
there are
time to go
varied
through that, but I
ways to
would,
do
I
it.
mean, I was going to go back to Yusek Carl, and obviously we will let you know what we find out. I just don't have time to dissect all the slides at this point.
And then just one important point, Madam Chair. We heard from both Philip Morris and Juul about how their products are helping smokers to stop smoking. So could we get it on the record from both of them if they recommend their products as smoking cessation products?
Oh, okay, sure. So do you smoking cessation products? So what companies do we have here? Philip Morris, I suppose that's for IQOS, and Juul.
No, it's a good question. The answer is very simple. They're not cessation products. They're consumer products. Our position's very clear. If you don't smoke, don't start. If you do smoke, quit. If you can't quit, switch. These are switching products that allow people who would otherwise continue to smoke to get off the habit of using cigarettes.
And like I said, in the, not the next, but in the future hearings I intend to have, I would be very happy to hear more from the industry on how you will implement that. Is that your slogan or whatever? You know, that is something I really want to get into in another hearing. And from Jules?
Yes, very similar response. We do not intend to market or represent our product as a cessation device. We ask people to make the switch. We are a consumer product.
Such a product called that. What do you call it? It's a switch. What is it?
We ask people to make the
Make
switch.
the switch. But I mean, is there such a term? It's a switch product as opposed to a cessation product? No. So I hereby declare that is the term of the day, switch product. Thank you everyone for your patience. Good evening, and the hearing is suspended until the 17th. Thank you.